The sun slowly sets over the suburban sky of Macon, Georgia, painting the two-story wooden houses in the Willow Creek neighborhood a vibrant orange. Old oak trees line the street, their leaves gently swaying in the cool March breeze, carrying the sweet scent of spring. Here, about 10 miles from downtown, everything seems to slow down. The cheerful chirping of birds blends with the laughter of children echoing from backyards, and the distant hum of a lawnmower buzzes from a few houses away. This isn't Marcus Hayes' home, but in the coming days, it will be the place he and his beloved son, Ethan, will call their temporary haven. Marcus stood in the small kitchen of the rented house, holding a wooden spoon as he stirred the pot of mashed potatoes on the gas stove. At 48, he still maintained the sturdy physique of a former Delta Force commander, broad shoulders, muscular arms, though a few strands of silver now peppered his hair. The light blue shirt he wore was no longer crisp like it had been that morning, but his eyes sparkled with an undeniable pride as he glanced over at Ethan, who was sitting at the dining table just a few steps away. Ethan, 27 years old, standing nearly 6 feet tall, inherited his warm smile from his mother and his calm demeanor from his father. He's wearing a gray hoodie with the sleeves rolled up, deeply focused on cutting a piece of grilled steak on his plate. His plate is piled high with creamy mashed potatoes, sautéed green beans, and a mouth-watering piece of beef that Marcus has been grilling in the backyard for 2 hours. This isn't just dinner. It's a celebration. After countless sleepless nights of studying and moments of stress that made him feel like giving up, Ethan has officially graduated from medical school at Emory University in Atlanta. The diploma is in his hands, and in just a few months, he'll be stepping into the emergency room as a full-fledged doctor. You know, Marcus said, setting the pot of potatoes down on the stove, his voice wore with a hint of teasing. When your dad was your age, he didn't even know how to hold a knife properly to cut meat, let alone anything like surgery. Ethan laughed, looking up at his dad. Oh, so you were a Special Forces soldier, huh? I thought guys like you were supposed to be experts with a knife. Sure, we have knives, Marcus shrugged, walking over to the dining table with a steaming bowl of mashed potatoes. But surgical knives are a different story. You're way better than me, kiddo. He sat down across from Ethan, his eyes squinting as he tried to hide the joy bubbling up inside him. By the way, take your time eating. Don't get that nice shirt all greasy. If your mom were here, she'd be nagging both of us all night long. Ethan smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes when he mentioned his mother. That woman had passed away 15 years ago, leaving Marcus and Ethan with beautiful memories, but also a sense of longing. Marcus knew this, and he quickly changed the subject. Come on, are you really going to hang that medical degree on the wall in our living room? Or are you worried it'll embarrass me since all I've ever known how to do is shoot guns? I'll hang it up, Ethan replied firmly, but not to show off. I want every time I look at it to remind me of how hard I had to work. And you too, Dad. You've always been there, even when I almost dropped out in my sophomore year. Marcus stopped eating and set his fork down. He looked at Ethan for a long time, as if he wanted to etch this moment into his memory. You've never let me down, Ethan, not a single day. His voice cracked, not from fatigue, but from a surge of emotion. He had fought through countless battlefields in Iraq and Afghanistan, places where death was always lurking, but nothing compared to pride he felt seeing his only son rise up after every hardship, becoming the man he knew would change the world. Outside, the light gradually faded, giving way to a gentle darkness that enveloped the neighborhood. The sound of crickets began to chirp, blending with the breeze that wafted through the open window in the living room. Marcus stood up, wiping his hands on the old apron hanging by the chair. I've got something for you, he said, his voice dropping as if sharing a secret. But I can't give it to you just yet. Let me go grab it from the car. You keep eating here. Ethan raised an eyebrow, curious. What's the secret? Don't tell me Dad bought more steak. I'm already stuffed. Marcus laughed heartily, his laughter echoing in the peaceful atmosphere of the house. Not food, kid. Just sit tight and don't sneak a peek. He shot Ethan a look that said, Dad's serious here, before stepping out the front door. His old sneakers hit the wooden porch with a soft thud as he made his way to the yard. The black SUV was parked 20 feet away, beneath the shade of a large oak tree, quietly blending into the night. He didn't know that, from across the street, a pair of eyes was watching. Mrs. Ellen Parker, a woman in her 60s living at 17 Willow Creek, stood behind the curtain of her living room. She gripped the cordless phone tightly, her fingers trembling as she dialed 911. "Hello, is this the police?" Her voice was low, but filled with anxiety. "I see a suspicious man out on the street. He's loitering near a car, looking around like he's afraid someone will see him. I've never seen him here before. No, I don't think he lives around here." On the other end of the line, the calm voice of the operator said, "Please stay inside your home. We will send someone right away." Ellen nodded, even though no one could see her, then stepped back behind the curtain, her heart pounding. She wasn't malicious, just a neighbor who tended to worry, but she had no idea that this call would change everything. Marcus, completely unaware, opened the car door and leaned down to grab a small box wrapped in blue paper from the back seat. It weighed about half a pound, fitting perfectly in the palm of his hand. He smiled, imagining Ethan's expression when he opened a gift he had held onto for a long time, something that meant far more than its material value. He closed the car door, turned around, and walked up the front steps. Through the window, he saw Ethan still sitting there, savoring the last bite of his steak, completely oblivious to the storm quietly brewing. Somewhere a few miles from Willow Creek, 2 patrol cars quietly revved their engines, headlights off, heading straight for this peaceful neighborhood. The soft rumble of the engines echoed in the night, a warning that went unheard. The tranquility of Marcus and Ethan was now measured in mere minutes. The front door of the rental house in Willow Creek creaked softly as Marcus pushed it open, stepping inside with a small blue box in hand. The air inside was still warm, the aroma of grilled steak and mashed potatoes wafting through, a reminder of the happy moment he and Ethan had just shared. The golden light from the chandelier above the dining table illuminated Ethan's face. He was still sitting there, just setting his fork down on the plate, his eyes lighting up with curiosity as he saw his dad walk in. "All right, Dad, have I kept you in suspense long enough?" Ethan said, his voice laced with a hint of teasing. He leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. "What's in that box? Don't tell me it's your old medal. I'm not hanging that next to my medical degree anywhere." Marcus chuckled softly, placing the small box down on the table, right in front of Ethan. "It's not a medal. Kid, open it up and you'll see." He sat down in the chair across from him, arms crossed over his chest. Try and keep a calm expression, but the corners of his eyes crinkled with a hint of joy he couldn't quite hide. The little box, about 6 inches square, was carefully wrapped in gift paper and tied with a thin silver ribbon. It didn't look expensive, but the way Marcus gazed at it, the way he gently nudged it toward Ethan, made it clear this was no ordinary gift. Ethan raised an eyebrow and reached out to touch the wrapping paper. "Dad is really serious about this," he mumbled, then began to untie the ribbon. His movements were slow, as if he wanted to stretch this moment out, and Marcus didn't rush him. He just sat there, quietly watching, his heart beating a little faster, as he thought about what was inside something he had kept for so many years, waiting for the right moment to pass it on to his son. Outside, the night had enveloped Willow Creek. The houses lining the street were now just shadowy silhouettes, punctuated by the warm glow of light spilling from windows. The sound of crickets chirping grew louder, drowning out the noise of the first patrol car quietly turning the corner, about 200 feet from Marcus's house. The headlights went dark. The engine hummed softly, and the car came to a stop by the curb, hidden beneath the sprawling branches of a large oak tree. A second car appeared shortly after, parking about 50 feet away, near a green public trash can. 2 officers in the first car, Daniel Walsh and Tom Carver, exchanged quick words over the radio, their voices low and gravelly. Report about a suspicious guy around the car. Walsh, who was sitting behind the wheel, said. He was about 35 years old, with military-style crew cut, his eyes narrowing as he looked through the windshield toward the rental house. The neighbors called. They said they've never seen him around here. Carver, a few years younger, sat in the passenger seat, nodding. Doesn't really look like this area. Could be a car thief. He checked the Glock 22 resting on his thigh, his finger gliding over the gun's surface out of habit. Want to go check it out? Walsh smirked, not quite smiling. Yeah, let's go. But be careful. Who knows what he's got up his sleeve? He opened the car door and stepped out, the glossy black shoes hitting the pavement with a sharp crack. Carver followed, his right hand resting casually near his gun, his eyes scanning the quiet street. They didn't turn on the headlights or honk the horn. It wasn't necessary. For them, this was just a routine check, a small task and a long night shift in Macon. Inside the house, Ethan had just peeled off the wrapping paper, revealing a small wooden box with a glossy surface, engraved with the initials EH in a graceful cursive. He looked up at Marcus, his eyes a mix of surprise and confusion. "What is this, Dad? It looks really old." Marcus took a deep breath, his voice dropping to a nostalgic tone. "Go ahead, open it, and then I'll tell you a story." He leaned forward, resting his hands on the table, his eyes locked onto Ethan's. This was the moment he had been waiting for, not just for a few weeks, but for years, ever since Ethan was a scrawny little kid running around the backyard in Atlanta, clutching an old basketball. Ethan lifted the lid of the box, and inside was a silver pocket watch, its glass slightly fogged with age, the hands long since stopped ticking. Under the light, he could see the tiny engraved words inside the lid. "For Ethan, from Mom and Dad, with all our love." He picked it up, his fingers gliding over the cold surface, then looked up at Marcus, his mouth agape but unable to find the words. "Your mom and I bought this when you were born," Marcus began, his voice soft yet heavy with emotion. "Your mom wanted to leave you something special, something you could hold on to forever. After she passed, I kept it, planning to give it to you when you were older, but then I thought your medical school graduation would be the perfect time." He paused, a bittersweet smile crossing his face. "You make me so proud, Ethan, more than I ever dreamed possible." Ethan clutched the watch tightly, his eyes misting over a bit. "Dad," he cleared his throat, trying to stay calm. "I don't know what to say. Thank you, really." He set the watch down on the table, stood up, and walked over to embrace Marcus. Marcus wrapped his arms around him, holding him tight, feeling the warmth from the son he had spent his whole life protecting. But that moment didn't last long. Through the window, red and blue lights suddenly cut through the darkness, casting streaks of color on the dining room wall like splattered paint. The sound of an engine roared, closer than Marcus expected, accompanied by heavy footsteps on the path leading to the house. Ethan let go of his hand, turned to look outside, his brow furrowed. "What's going on, Dad?" Marcus stood up and walked over to the window, pulling the curtain aside. 2 patrol cars were parked right in front of the yard, their lights flashing brightly, and 4 figures in police uniforms were approaching, hands resting casually near their holsters. His heart raced faster, not out of fear, but from a bad feeling he had learned to recognize from his years on the battlefield. "I don't know," he said, his voice dropping, sounding more resolute. "But stay calm, let me handle this." The knock on the door was loud and firm. "This is Officer Macon," a man's voice called out, cold and unyielding. "Open the door and put your hands up where we can see them." Ethan looked at Marcus, his eyes wide. "Dad, what's going on?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He walked to the door, gripping the doorknob tightly, taking a deep breath to steady himself. He had faced guns, death. But this time was different. This time was Ethan. It was his family. It was the most precious thing he had. "Just stay right there," he said to Ethan, his voice steady. "Dad will take care of this." The front door of the rental house in Willow Creek swung open, revealing the silhouettes of 4 police officers standing tall under the flashing red and blue lights of 2 patrol cars parked in the driveway. The peaceful night in Macon was shattered, the sounds of crickets drowned out by the low hum of engines and the thud of leather shoes hitting the stone walkway. Marcus Hayes stood firm in the doorway, broad-shouldered, his sharp eyes scanning the scene, hands relaxed at his sides, but ready to react at a moment's notice, a habit he carried over from his days in Delta Force. Ethan stood a few feet behind him, eyes wide with confusion, his hand still gripping the silver watch that Marcus had just handed him. Leading Officer Daniel Walsh stood about 6 feet 2, dressed in his Macon police uniform with a snug bulletproof vest. His piercing eyes were sharp beneath the brim of his cap, and his right hand rested casually near the Glock 22 at his hip. "We receive reports of suspicious activity in this area," Walsh said, his tone steady yet commanding. "2 individuals need to step out. Hands up where we can see them." Marcus stood still. He stared directly at Walsh, assessing every movement of the man how he stood, the way his other hand subtly tensed. The three officers behind him, including Tom Carver, forming a semicircle, ready to spring into action. This wasn't Marcus's first encounter with gunfire, but this time felt different. This was his home, even if just temporarily, and Ethan was right behind him. Suspicious activity? Marcus repeated, his voice low and deliberate, as if he were weighing each word. "We were having dinner in our own home. I just stepped out to grab something from the car. Is that a crime?" Walsh smirked, not quite a smile, but more like a shrug with his face. "We don't know who you are, and we don't know what you're doing. The neighbors called, so we came to check it out. Now step outside with your hands up. You too, buddy." He tilted his head toward Ethan, his tone growing more rigid. Ethan took a step forward, instinctively raising his hand, but Marcus held his hand up to stop him. "Stay right there, Ethan," he said, his voice low but firm. Then he turned to look at Walsh. "This is our rented home. We're from Atlanta, here for a few days to relax. My son just graduated from medical school. We're not doing anything wrong. You can check our papers if you want, but don't stand there ordering us around like we're criminals." Tom Carver stood a few steps away from Walsh, smirking. He was younger, around 30, with short blonde hair and eyes that sparkled with impatience. "Sounds nice, but we don't care what story you have to tell. Someone called 911, saying they spotted a guy loitering around a car, looking around like he was hiding from someone. We're not here to listen to explanations. We're here to ensure safety. So, follow our orders or things are going to get a lot tougher." Marcus felt the heat rise into his head, but he kept his cool. He had seen that look too many times, the look that didn't care who he was, just that his skin color and appearance were enough for them to decide he was a threat. He had fought in places where survival depended on every second, every decision. But here on American soil, he was treated like an enemy just for daring to exist. "I'm not loitering," he said, his voice firmer. "I'm here to pick up a gift for my son. It's right over there on that table. If you want to come in and check, go ahead, but don't stand there accusing us before you even ask for facts." Ethan spoke up, his voice trembling but trying to stay calm. "I can get my phone and show you the rental agreement. It's on the app. I booked it online. We haven't done anything wrong." He took another step forward, his hand reaching for his pocket, but Marcus immediately turned back, his eyes sharp as a knife. "Don't move," Marcus said, his voice low but sharp. He knew all too well that in situations like this, even the slightest wrong move could turn everything into a disaster. Ethan froze, his hand still hovering in the air, looking at his father with bewildered expression. Walsh furrowed his brow, his grip tightening around the gun. "I said, hands up, both of you. We're not asking again." His voice was no longer steady. It was cold, laced with a clear threat. Carver stepped forward, his hand now firmly on the gun, eyes locked onto Ethan, as if he were a ticking bomb ready to explode. Marcus took a deep breath, his hands slowly rising, not out of fear, but because he knew he needed to keep everything under control. "All right," he said, his voice calm yet heavy with weight. "But I want you to remember, we are not criminals. We have a right to be here. My son is not a threat to anyone." Ethan slowly raised his hand like his father, his gaze flickering between Marcus and the officers. "Dad, why is this happening?" he whispered, his voice trailing off in confusion. "We were just having dinner." Marcus didn't answer right away. He turned to look at Ethan, his gaze softening a bit, as if trying to reassure him. "Just stay calm, kiddo. I'll handle this." But inside, a simmering anger began to ignite not a raging fire, but something deeper, colder, forged through years of being treated like an outsider in his own homeland. Walsh signaled for Carver and the two other officers to move forward. "Both of you step outside. Keep your hands on your heads. We'll check everything, and then we'll sort it out later." He stepped aside, allowing Marcus and Ethan to pass, but his gaze never left them for a second. Marcus stepped forward, each heavy but steady footfall, like a soldier entering the battlefield. Ethan followed closely behind, his breath quickening, his hands trembling slightly despite his effort to keep them raised. The flashing lights in the patrol car illuminated their faces, highlighting the stark contrast between Marcus, with the calm demeanor of a seasoned warrior, and Ethan, with the innocence of someone who never imagined his life could be turned upside down in just a few minutes. As they stood on the front lawn, about 10 feet away from the black SUV, Walsh spoke up again. "What are your names?" "Marcus Hayes," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "This is my son, Ethan Hayes. We're from Atlanta, and we rented this house through an app. All the paperwork is in order." Carver scoffed again, shaking his head. "Yeah, sure, but we still have to check. Who knows? The paperwork might look good, but the behavior could be shady." He stepped closer to Ethan, his hand still resting on the gun, his gaze scrutinizing as if searching for an excuse. Marcus turned to Carver, his eyes narrowing. "If you want to check, then do it quickly. But don't stand there insulting my son." His voice was low, yet carried the weight of a command he once used to lead the soldiers under his authority. Carver stopped, his eyes flashing with annoyance, but Walsh raised a hand to stop him. "That's enough, Tom. Check the car first." He turned to Marcus. "You stay right there. We'll handle our business." But Marcus knew, deep down in his bones, that their business rarely stopped at mere inspection. He could feel the storm brewing, not from the sky, but from the people standing in front of him. And he could only hope that Ethan wouldn't have to pay the price for it. The darkness in Willow Creek was no longer the serene picture of wooden houses and oak trees. The flashing red and blue lights from 2 patrol cars illuminated the front yard of the rented house, turning it into a tent stage where Marcus Hayes and Ethan Hayes stood facing for Macon police officers. The night wind blew through, carrying a bone-chilling cold, but Marcus didn't feel it. The blood in his veins was boiling, not out of fear, but from something deeper, the simmering rage of a man who had sacrificed everything for this country, only to be treated like an outsider right in his own homeland. Daniel Walsh, the lead officer, stood about 5 feet away from Marcus, his cold eyes scanning from him to Ethan. "We need to check the house," Walsh said, his voice devoid of emotion, as if this were just a routine procedure. "If everything is as you say, then there won't be a problem, but you need to cooperate." Marcus held his hand up high, but his gaze never left Walsh. "Cooperate," he repeated, his voice low but sharp as a knife. "I've given you our names, made it clear what we're here for. You could go inside, see dinner on the table, see the paperwork on my son's phone. But you don't want to check. You want us to kneel down to prove our innocence, right?" Tom Carver, standing next to Walsh, took a step forward, his hand tightening around the gun. "You're talking too much," he growled, his eyes flashing with irritation. "We're not here to argue. Step aside or we'll make you." Ethan, still standing behind Marcus, couldn't hold back any longer. "You can't do this," he exclaimed, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and confusion. "We're not breaking any laws. You have no right to barge into our home without a reason." He raised his hand higher, as if to prove he wasn't a threat, but his eyes blazed a fire that Marcus rarely saw in his son. "Ethan, be quiet," Marcus said quickly, turning his head to shoot him a glance. He recognized that tone, the voice of a young man full of ideals, ready to stand up for what's right. But he also knew, from hard-earned experience, that ideals don't always win in situations like this, not when the other side has a gun and no reason to pull the trigger. Walsh smirked, his gaze shifting to Ethan. "You want to explain the law to us, kid? We got a call from a neighbor, and we have the right to check things out. Now step back, or I'll take that as resistance." He signaled to Carver and the 2 other officers, both of whom remained silent but had their hands poised on their weapons as they moved in closer. Marcus felt the air thicken around him, just like before a battle he had faced in Baghdad, where everything could explode in an instant. He took a small step forward, just enough to position himself between Ethan and the officers, his voice dropping but carrying a heavy weight. "If you want to come in, then come in. But my son is not your target for your anger. We're not resisting. We just want to follow the law, just like I did when I served this country." Carver scoffed and shook his head. "Serve the country? Nice try. But you're not in uniform anymore, buddy. You're just a guy standing here, and we're the ones holding the law." He stepped closer, just about 3 feet away from Marcus. His thumb hooked into his belt near his gun, as if to provoke. Marcus remained still, but his eyes narrowed. He could smell the sweat and arrogance radiating from Carver, a scent he had encountered before in those who believed themselves invincible simply because they wore a badge. "You're right," he replied, his voice icy. "I'm not in uniform anymore, but I bled for the law you're holding there. And you? What are you doing besides standing here threatening a father and his son who are just trying to have dinner?" The air was silent for a moment. Only the sound of the wind rustling and the distant hum of a patrol car. Walsh raised his hand, stopping Carver before he could respond. "That's enough," Walsh said, his voice harsh and dry. "We're going to search the vehicle and the house. You stay right there or I'll cuff you right now." He turned to Carver. "Check the SUV. I'll head inside." Carver nodded and walked toward the black car 10 feet away, while Walsh and another officer approached the front door of the house. Marcus turned to look at Ethan, his gaze softening a bit. "Just stay put, kid. Let them do their job. Everything will be okay." But deep down, he knew those words were just a lie to reassure himself that everything was not okay, and it had never been okay in situations like this. Ethan nodded, but his hands trembled, his eyes glued to Carver's back as he opened the car door and rummaged inside. "Dad, why don't they believe us?" he whispered, his voice trailing off. "We didn't do anything wrong." Marcus didn't respond right away. He watched Walsh step through the doorway, his gaze sweeping over the dining table where the steak and potatoes still sat warm and where the silver watch lay quietly beside the gift box. He wanted to tell Ethan that this wasn't about right or wrong, but about how they were seen, how they were always seen. But he didn't have time to explain. The air was heavier than ever, and he felt deep in his bones that the real storm had only just begun. Walsh stepped out a few minutes later, holding Ethan's phone that he had taken from the table. "We'll check this," he said, his voice completely emotionless. "If everything matches up, you might just be lucky." Marcus stared straight into Walsh's eyes, saying nothing. But in his mind, a voice echoed, cold and clear, "Luck is not what I need from you." And when Carver turned back in the SUV, throwing a challenging glance his way, Marcus knew that tonight would not end peacefully. The night in Willow Creek had shifted from peaceful to suffocating, the heavy air pressing down on Marcus Hayes' shoulders as he stood on the front porch of the rental house, hands raised high, eyes locked on the police officers from Macon. The red and blue flashing lights from 2 patrol cars illuminated his face, highlighting the rugged features of a man who had once been a Delta Force commander. Ethan stood just behind him, about 3 feet away, his hands also raised, but his gaze flickered between confusion and anger. The silver watch, a gift Marcus had just given, still lay on the dining table inside, a stark reminder of the joyful moment that had been abruptly interrupted. Daniel Walsh stepped out of the house, holding Ethan's phone, his gaze as cold as steel. "We're going to check this," he said, his voice dry and emotionless. "If everything matches up, you're lucky." He handed the phone to Tom Carver, who was standing next to the black SUV, his other hand resting casually on the Glock 22 at his hip. Carver smirked, throwing a challenging glance at Marcus before leaning down to look at the phone screen. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He had made it clear to them that he and Ethan had rented this house through an app, coming from Atlanta to relax after Ethan graduated from medical school. Dinner was still on the table, the paperwork valid on his phone. But he knew, deep down in his bones, that the truth didn't matter to Walsh and Carver. To them, he and Ethan weren't a father and son enjoying an evening. They were a suspicion, a target, something that needed to be controlled. "Do you see it now?" Marcus said, his voice low but sharp, cutting through the night wind. "Everything is clear. We're not thieves. We're not criminals. You can leave now." Walsh turned back to look at him, his eyes narrowing. "You don't get to decide when we leave," he replied, stepping closer, just about 4 feet away from Marcus. "We're not done yet. Stay right there and keep quiet." He signaled to the other 2 officers, silent but menacing figures, to move in, forming a loose circle around Marcus and Ethan. Ethan couldn't take it anymore. "This is ridiculous," he blurted out, his voice rising with anger. "You have no right to treat us like this. I can prove it, just let me open the app, and I'll show you the rental confirmation." He lowered one hand slowly and carefully, intending to reach into his pocket for the backup phone he always carried. "Don't move," Carver shouted, his voice ringing out like a gunshot in the still night. In an instant, he dropped Ethan's phone to the ground, his right hand drawing the Glock from its holster, aiming it straight at Ethan. Marcus turned his head, his eyes wide, heart pounding as he saw the gun pointed at his son. "Ethan, stop!" Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with a rare panic he had never felt even on the battlefield. He raised a hand toward Ethan, as if trying to pull him back with sheer will. But Ethan had frozen, his hand suspended in midair, eyes wide as he stared down the barrel of the gun less than 10 feet away. "Hands up!" Walsh shouted, pulling out his gun and aiming at Marcus. The other two officers immediately took their positions, guns held firmly, their eyes darting between the father and son. The air thickened, as if time had slowed down, each second stretching out into a century. "I'm not doing anything," Ethan said, his voice trembling, but still trying to stay calm. "I just want to get my phone to prove it. You guys don't need to do this." He slowly raised his other hand, palm open, as if to show that he wasn't armed, that he posed no threat. But Carver didn't listen. His eyes flashed with a mix of panic and arrogance, his finger tightening on the trigger. "I said hands up right now," he shouted, his voice cracking, as if he was losing control himself. Marcus could feel the way Carver stood, the slight tremor in his hands, the rapid rise and fall of his breath. This wasn't an officer on duty. This was a scared man, and that fear was more dangerous than any command. All right, Marcus said quickly, his voice tightening as he tried to take control of the situation. "We'll do what you say. Don't do anything stupid. My son isn't armed. He just wants to get his phone." He took a small step forward, just enough to grab Walsh and Carver's attention, hoping to draw them away from Ethan. But it was too late. Ethan, in a last-ditch effort to clarify everything, leaned down a bit, his right hand reaching into his pocket. "I'm just getting my phone," he said, his voice more confident, as if believing that the truth would protect him. "I can prove it." The sound of gunfire erupted, tearing through the night. One shot, then two, then three, so fast that Marcus couldn't react. All he saw was Ethan's body jerk violently backward, his arms flailing the air like a puppet with its strings cut. Blood splattered, dark red under the flashing lights, soaking into gray hoodie he was wearing. Ethan fell onto the grass, less than 5 feet away from Marcus, his eyes wide open, mouth agape as if he wanted to say something but couldn't. "No!" Marcus roared, his voice breaking like a wounded animal. He charged toward Ethan, disregarding Walsh's gun still aimed at him, ignoring Carver's shouts and the chaotic footsteps of other officers. He knelt beside his son, wrapping his arms around the boy's body, warm blood streaming through his fingers, soaking into his shirt. "Ethan, look at Dad," Marcus shouted, pressing his hand tightly against his son's chest, trying to stem the flow of blood that was pouring out uncontrollably. "Hang in there, son. I'm here. I'm right here with you." But Ethan's eyes had glazed over, his breath short and weak, like a flickering flame about to go out. Blood pooled beneath them on the ground, spreading across the grass, glistening under the flashing lights like a horrific painting. Walsh and Carver stood there, guns still in hand, their faces pale. "He's pulling something out," Carver shouted, his voice trembling, as if trying to justify himself. But no one answered. Marcus's scream drowned out everything, echoing to the dark night of Willow Creek, stretching on endlessly. The front yard of the rented house in Willow Creek was no longer a peaceful patch of lush green grass. It had turned into a small battlefield, where the blood of Ethan Hayes soaked the ground, spreading into dark red streaks under the flashing red and blue lights of 2 patrol cars. Marcus Hayes knelt beside his son, his hand pressed tightly against Ethan's chest, where 3 bullets from Tom Carver's Glock had pierced through, leaving gaping, bleeding wounds that wouldn't stop. His breath came in ragged gasps, his eyes wide open, desperately trying to hold on to the fading light in Ethan's gaze. Warm blood flowed through his fingers, soaking into the light blue shirt he wore, but he didn't care. All he could see, all he could feel, was his only son lying here on the cold grass. "Ethan, look at me," Marcus shouted again, his voice hoarse, shattered like broken glass. He leaned in close, his face just inches from Ethan's, desperately trying to catch his gaze. "You have to hang in there, okay? Just look at me. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." But Ethan didn't respond. His eyes, once bright with joy when he received the silver watch from Marcus less than 20 minutes ago, were now dull and empty, drifting toward a place Marcus couldn't reach. His breaths came in short gasps, weak and labored. Each inhale a painful wheeze, each exhale a piece of life slipping away from him. 5 feet away, Tom Carver stood there, his gun trembling in his hand, his face as pale as a sheet of paper. "He's pulling something out," Carver repeated, his voice high-pitched and frantic, as if he were trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "I saw his hand move. I have to shoot. I have no other choice." But his justification was swallowed by the roar of Marcus, completely drowning him out. "My son isn't armed." Marcus turned around, his eyes blazing, roaring at Carver like a wounded beast. He just took the phone. "Why did you kill him? Why?" He didn't get up, didn't charge at Carver as the instinct of a Delta Force warrior urged him to. He couldn't, because Ethan was still lying here in his arms, and he couldn't leave him. Daniel Walsh stepped forward, gun still in hand but lowered, his gaze flickering between Carver and the scene before him. "Calm down," Walsh said, his voice dry but no longer as confident as before. "We'll call an ambulance. Don't do anything stupid." He turned to another officer, quickly issuing a command over the radio. "Call 911. Request an ambulance to Willow Creek right now. Someone's been shot." But Marcus heard nothing but the pounding of his own heart in his chest and the faint breaths of Ethan. He leaned in closer, his other hand cradling the boy's head, his fingers weaving through the soft black hair now soaked with sweat and blood. "Son, don't leave me," he whispered, his voice trembling, tears streaming down his face, falling onto Ethan's. "You just graduated. You have your whole life ahead of you. Don't go, Ethan. Please!" He pressed harder against the boy's chest, blood still gushing out, soaking his hands, running into grass. But he didn't stop, he couldn't stop. Ethan coughed softly, a weak cough, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth, bright red under the light. His eyes searched for Marcus, and for a brief moment, they lit up one last time, as if wanting to say something. "Dad," he whispered, his voice fragile like a gentle breeze. I just wanted to..." But the words never came to completion. His hand, gripping Marcus's arm, squeezed gently one last time, then fell away. His head tilted to the side, his eyes closed, and his breath ceased altogether. No, Ethan!" Marcus screamed, his voice tearing through the night, echoing across Willow Creek, drowning out even the crackle of Walsh's radio and the frantic footsteps of other officers. He held Ethan tightly, pulling him into his arms, as if he could keep him there, as if the strength that had helped him survive countless battlefields could somehow bring Ethan back. But nothing happened. Ethan lay there motionless, his face oddly peaceful amidst the spreading pool of blood. Marcus looked up, his tear-filled eyes staring at Carver and Walsh. "What have you done?" he shouted, his voice no longer that of a pleading father. It was the voice of a soldier, a man who had just lost the most precious thing in the world. "You killed my son. He did nothing wrong." He held Ethan tighter, his body shaking with pain and rage, tears streaming down his face, but his gaze burned with fire that none of them could extinguish. Carver took a step back, the gun clattered into the ground with a harsh clink. I didn't mean to," he stammered, his voice trembling. "I thought he had a gun." But he couldn't continue. His face twisted, stripped of the smugness he had earlier, now only reflecting the panic of someone who just realized they had crossed a line of no return. Walsh turned away, gripping the radio tightly, his voice dropping as he spoke into it. "Where's the ambulance? Hurry up, it's bad." But he knew, just like Marcus knew, that the ambulance wouldn't make it in time. Ethan was gone, right there on the field, less than 10 feet away from the black SUV where Marcus had gone to grab a gift for him. Marcus leaned down, pressing his forehead against Ethan's, tears streaming down his face onto his son's growing cold skin. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect you." He held Ethan tightly for what felt like an eternity, as if time could stand still, as if his son's death was just a nightmare he would wake up from. But reality remained unchanged. Ethan was gone, and Marcus's world shattered into a million pieces right in his arms. The sound of the ambulance siren echoed from afar, cutting through the night in Willow Creek. But it was just a meaningless noise to Marcus Hayes. He knelt on the grass, holding Ethan's lifeless body tightly in his arms, his son's blood soaking through his shirt. Pooling on the ground, a deep red beneath the flashing red and blue lights of 2 patrol cars. His hands trembled, not from the cold, even though the night wind carried the chill of March, but from the agony tearing apart his heart. Each stab, each slice, like a knife cutting into flesh. Ethan was gone, his eyes tightly shut, his face oddly serene amidst the chaos, as if he had found a peace that Marcus could never reach. "Ethan," Marcus whispered, his voice choked with emotion, tears streaming down his son's cold face. He leaned in closer, pressing his forehead against Ethan's, as if trying to share one last bit of warmth, as if he wanted to hold on to him for just one more second. "I'm so sorry, son. I'm so sorry." His words dissolved into the air unanswered, as no one could respond. Ethan, the son he had raised, protected, and placed all his hopes in, was now just a lifeless body in his arms. A few feet away, Daniel Walsh stood frozen, his gun lowered long ago, his eyes darting between Marcus and Tom Carver. Carver continued to back away, his face pale, hands trembling as he stared down at the Glock lying on the grass, just about 3 feet away from him. "I didn't mean to," Carver repeated, his voice fading, as if he were talking to himself. "I thought he had a gun. But his excuses were cut off by Marcus's scream, a cry that no longer carried pain. It was now pure rage, a fire igniting from the ashes of despair. "Shut up," Marcus roared, his head snapping up, his bloodshot eyes locking onto Carver. "You killed my son. He wasn't armed. He had nothing. You shot him because you wanted to, because you looked at him and saw something that scared you." He held Ethan tighter, as if trying to shield him from Carver's meaningless words. But deep down he knew it didn't matter anymore. Ethan was gone, and no words could change that truth. Walsh stepped forward, raising a hand as if to calm the situation. "Listen, we'll handle this," he said, his voice dry but tinged with a hint of confusion he couldn't hide. "The ambulance is on its way. You need to step back so we can—" But before he could finish, Marcus interrupted. "Back off," Marcus repeated, his voice dropping, cold as ice. He slowly set Ethan down on the grass, his hands trembling as they left the boy's body. But his gaze never wavered from Walsh and Carver. "You just killed my son right in front of me, and now you're telling me to back off?" He stood up, tall and menacing. Ethan's blood splattered all over his shirt and hands, like an indelible mark. "You have no right to tell me what to do anymore." The other 2 officers, who had just been standing still until now, stepped forward, their hands resting on their guns, their eyes tense. "You need to calm down," one of them said, his voice trembling. "Don't do anything stupid, or we'll have to—" "What am I supposed to do?" Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp as a knife. He stepped forward, just about 4 feet away from Walsh, his eyes blazing with the fire he once used to confront enemies on the battlefield. "Have you done enough? You killed my son, a kid who just graduated from medical school, a kid who wanted to save lives. And now you stand there, guns drawn as if I'm the threat." Walsh took a step back, his grip tightening on the radio. "I told you we'll handle it. Don't force us to use force." But his voice lacked the confidence he once had. He knew, just as Carver did, that they had just crossed a line of no return. Carver's face was now twisted, his eyes darting around as if searching for a way to escape this nightmare. Marcus didn't answer right away. He turned back to Ethan, lying there on the grass, blood still flowing from wounds that no one could heal. He knelt down again, gently brushing his fingers across the boy's face, tears streaming down his own, falling onto Ethan's cheek. "I just wanted to help others," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You didn't deserve to die like this." He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and when he opened them again, his gaze was no longer that of a grieving father. It was that of a warrior, someone who had lost everything and had nothing left to fear. He stood up once more, turning to Walsh and Carver. "You won't get away with this," he said, his voice low and cold, each word like a curse. "I fought for this country, bled for it, and this is what I get? My son died on his own doorstep because you couldn't even see him as a human being." He pointed a trembling finger at Carver, rage coursing through him. "You will pay. Both of you will pay." The sound of the ambulance siren was getting closer, echoing through the quiet streets of Willow Creek. The lights in the distance began to illuminate the wooden houses. But Marcus didn't care. He turned back to Ethan, knelt down, and held him close one last time. The darkness was no longer a place where he found peace. It was where he lost everything. Walsh turned away, ordering the other officers to prepare their reports. Carver remained there, frozen, his gaze vacant. But Marcus didn't look at them anymore. He only focused on Ethan, and inside him, a fire had ignited, a fire of justice, of revenge, of a father who would never let his son's death fade into oblivion. The night in Willow Creek was no longer a quiet veil draping over the wooden houses and oak trees. It transformed into a small battlefield, where Ethan Hayes' blood soaked the grass in front of the rental house. Marcus Hayes knelt beside his son, holding tightly to the body that was growing colder in his arms. The flashing red and blue lights from 2 patrol cars illuminated his face, highlighting the once strong features now twisted in pain and fury. The wail of an ambulance echoed in the distance, but brought no hope. Ethan was gone, and Marcus knew that better than anyone. His son's blood still flowed through his fingers, soaking into his shirt, but he couldn't let him go. He couldn't let go. Daniel Walsh stood a few feet away, holding a walkie-talkie, his voice low and tense as he spoke to the approaching paramedic team. "Hurry up, it's bad." But he couldn't bring himself to look directly at Marcus. His gaze flickered restless, as if he had just realized that Ethan's death was not just an incident they could cover up with a few lines in a report. Tom Carver had stepped back even further. The Glock he used to shoot Ethan lying on the grass about 3 feet away from him, his hands trembling, his face pale, as if he had just seen a ghost. "I didn't mean to," Carver mumbled, his voice weak, but no one cared about his words anymore. Marcus heard nothing but the pounding of his own heart in his chest, alongside the last breaths of Ethan still echoing in his mind. He bent down, pressing his forehead against his son's one last time, tears streaming down Ethan's face, mingling with the dry blood on his cheek. "I won't let this go unnoticed, son," he whispered, his voice choked yet filled with determination. "I promise." He laid Ethan down on the grass gently, as if afraid to cause him any more pain, even though he could no longer feel anything. His hand trembled as it left his son's body, but as he stood up, his broad shoulders squared, and his gaze shifted from anguish to something colder, harder, the flame of a warrior ignited from the ashes of loss. He turned to Walsh and Carver, Ethan's blood still smeared across his hands and shirt, like an undeniable accusation. "You think this is over?" Marcus said, his voice low and sharp, each word cutting like a knife. "You killed my son, a defenseless kid, just trying to prove he belonged here. And now you stand there, as if everything will just blow over." Walsh raised his hand, tried to maintain his composure. "Listen, you need to back off," he said, his voice dry but slightly trembling. "We're going to report this. Don't do anything to make things worse." He took a step forward, his left hand extended as if to soothe, but his right hand still gripped the lowered gun tightly. Marcus scoffed, a laugh devoid of joy, filled only with bitterness and contempt. "Worse," he repeated, his voice dropping, as cold as ice. "My son lies dead on the ground because of you, and you tell me not to do anything worse? What could possibly be worse than this?" He stepped forward, closing the distance to about 4 feet from Walsh, his eyes blazing with the fire he once used to confront enemies on the battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan. Carver panicked, taking a step back, his hands raised as if to defend himself. I don't want this," he stammered, his voice trembling. "I thought he had a gun. I was just doing my job." But his words only fueled Marcus's anger. He turned to look at Carver, his gaze sharp as a knife, and in an instant, everything inside him exploded. "Don't talk to me about your business," Marcus shouted, his voice echoing across the yard, drowning out even the sound of the approaching ambulance sirens. "Is your business killing innocent people? Shooting a kid who's just trying to explain? He charged forward, not with the frenzy of someone out of control, but with the precision of a Delta Force warrior, fast, fierce, and relentless. Carver didn't have time to react. Marcus grabbed him by the collar, his left hand tightening its grip, while his right fist slammed into Carver's face with enough force to send him sprawling backward. A crack echoed as Marcus's punch connected with Carver's cheekbone, and he fell to the ground, clutching his face and groaning, blood streaming from his nose. "You don't deserve to breathe the same air as my son," Marcus shouted, his voice trembling with rage, but his actions didn't stop. Walsh charged in, shouting, "Stop right there." He raised his gun, aiming it at Marcus, but Marcus didn't care. In a lightning-fast move, Marcus spun around, using his left hand to swat Walsh's gun aside, while his right fist drove straight into Walsh's gut. Walsh doubled over, gasping for air, and the gun clattered to the ground with a sharp thud. Marcus didn't hold back. He grabbed Walsh by the shoulders, yanked him up, and then delivered a powerful kick to his knee, sending Walsh crashing face first into grass, clutching his stomach and groaning. The two remaining officers rushed in, shouting, "Get down! Hands on your head!" They raised their guns, but Marcus didn't listen. He stood there, breathless, Ethan's blood on his hands now mixed with Carver's blood on his fists. He looked at them, his gaze no longer that of a grieving father. It was that of a soldier, one who had lost everything and was ready to burn it all down to reclaim justice. The sound of the ambulance siren was getting closer, the white lights shining down the street. But Marcus didn't care. He turned back to look at Ethan, lying there on the grass, and his heart shattered all over again. He knew he couldn't bring Ethan back, but he also knew one thing for sure. Walsh and Carver wouldn't get away with this. Not ever. The front yard of the rental house in Willow Creek is now a chaotic scene, the lush green grass stained with the blood of Ethan Hayes. The red and blue flashing lights from two patrol cars illuminate the struggling figures in the darkness. Marcus Hayes stands in the midst of it all, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his hands soaked in the blood of his son and the blood of Tom Carver, who has just collapsed on the grass about 5 feet away, clutching his face and moaning. Daniel Walsh lies face down not far off, holding his stomach, his legs curled up after a powerful kick to the knee from Marcus. Walsh's gun lies discarded on the ground about 3 feet from him, the flashing lights glinting off its cold metal surface. The two remaining officers who had been standing still and observing from the beginning now rushed forward, guns raised high, their eyes filled with a mix of panic and determination. "Get down now!" one of them shouted, his voice piercing, his hand trembling slightly as he aimed at Marcus. "Hands on your head. Don't make us shoot." The other officer moved to the side, trying to create a surrounding angle, but Marcus didn't budge. He stood there, tall and unyielding, blood dripping from his right fist onto grass, each drop falling steadily like the relentless beat of an unquenchable fury. "Do you want to shoot me?" Marcus said, his voice dropping, cold and sharp like a freshly honed blade. He turned to look at them, his eyes blazing with the fire he had suppressed for so many years, the fire of a Delta Force warrior who had survived battles that these men could only dare to dream about in nightmares. "Go ahead, shoot, but you won't be able to cover this up. Not ever." The sound of the ambulance siren was getting closer, echoing down Willow Creek Street, the white light from the headlights starting to illuminate the wooden houses about 200 feet away. But Marcus didn't care about the rescue coming. It was too late for Ethan, and now, to him, it meant nothing. He turned back to look at his son, lying motionless on the grass, less than 10 feet away, his eyes tightly shut, a peaceful face amidst a dried pool of blood. His heart twisted, but the pain had now mixed with fury, transforming into an unstoppable force. "You have no choice left," the second officer shouted, his voice trembling as he stepped closer, just about 6 feet away from Marcus. "Get down, hand behind your head, right now, if you don't." But he didn't get to finish his sentence. Marcus lunged forward, quick as a shadow, his left hand grabbing the officer's gun-wielding wrist and twisting hard. A sharp crack echoed as the joint snapped. The gun clattered into the ground, and the officer collapsed, clutching his arm and screaming in pain. The remaining officer panicked and pulled the trigger, but Marcus had already moved. He ducked low, narrowly avoiding a bullet that whizzed past his left shoulder, and charged straight at the shooter. He landed a powerful punch to the man's chest, a blow so forceful that it sent him crashing backward, hitting the ground with a heavy thud. The second officer's gun flew out his hand, rolling across the grass and coming to a stop near the black SUV. 15 feet away, the vehicle Marcus had gone to retrieve a gift for Ethan. The start of this nightmare. Marcus stood tall, his breath coming in quick gasps, blood trickling from a small scratch on his shoulder where the bullet had grazed him, but he felt no pain. He looked around. Carver was still cradling his face, moaning, while Walsh struggled to crawl back up. The other two officers lay on the ground, one clutching his arm, the other holding his chest, no longer able to fight back. The four who had come here with guns and badges, confident they held the power, were now just shadows of defeat before a father who had just lost a son. "You don't deserve that badge," Marcus said, his voice low and cold, each word hitting the air like a hammer. "You come here, kill my son, and think I'm just going to let it go?" He stepped closer to Walsh, who was struggling to get up, clutching his stomach, his face twisted in pain and fear. Marcus leaned down, grabbed the collar of his shirt, and yanked him up close to his face, just inches apart. "Look at me," he shouted, his voice trembling with rage. "Look into my eyes and tell me you didn't know what you were doing." Walsh gasped for breath, his eyes wide open, but he couldn't say a word. His mouth moved, but no words came out, only fear, the realization that he had lost control of the situation. Marcus tightened his grip on his collar for another second, then shoved him hard, sending Walsh crashing backward, hitting the ground again. "You're not worth killing," Marcus said, his voice dropping, cold as ice. "But I'll make sure you live without ever forgetting tonight." The sound of the ambulance engine was now just around the corner, its blinding white light illuminating the scene of chaos. Ethan lay on the grass, for defeated officers sprawled around, and Marcus stood amidst it all, blood splattered across him, his eyes burning with an unspoken vow. He turned back to Ethan, kneeling down once more, his hand gently resting on the boy's chest, where the heart had stopped beating. "I will get justice for you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion, tears streaming down his face, falling onto Ethan's. "I promise." The ambulance stopped 20 feet away. The doors swung open, and two paramedics rushed out, first aid bags slung over their shoulders. But Marcus didn't look up. He knew they couldn't save Ethan, no one could save him now. But he also knew one thing. His fight was just beginning. The white light from the ambulance illuminated the front yard of the rental house in Willow Creek, highlighting the chaotic scene like a horrifying painting. Ethan Hayes lay motionless on the grass, dry blood pooling around him. Tom Carver groaned 5 feet away, clutching his face, blood streaming from his nose. Daniel Walsh lay on his back on the ground, hands clutching his stomach, gasping for breath. The other two officers, one cradling a broken arm and the other holding his chest, huddled near a black SUV 15 feet away. Marcus Hayes stood amidst it all, tall and unyielding, his hands stained with the blood of Ethan and his enemies, breathing heavily, his eyes burning with an unquenchable fire. He had just taken down 4 Macon police officers who had killed his son in mere minutes, using the very strength and skills he once wielded on the battlefield. 2 medical staff rushed out of the ambulance, first aid bags slung over their shoulders, their eyes wide with panic as they took in the scene before them. "Where's the victim?" one shouted, his voice tense, but Marcus didn't respond. He knelt beside Ethan once more, his hand gently resting on the boy's chest, where the heart had long since stopped beating. He didn't look up, not caring about the hurried footsteps around him or the groans of Walsh and Carver. For him, the world now consisted only of Ethan, his son he had lost, and the promise he had just whispered into the darkness. "He's here," Marcus said, his voice deep and hoarse, not take his eyes off Ethan. "But you guys are too late." He gently brushed the boy's face, his fingers gliding over Ethan's cheek, where the blood had dried into faint streaks. The first paramedic, a man in his 40s with salt and pepper hair, knelt down in front of Marcus, placing his hand on Ethan's neck to check for a pulse. But just a few seconds later, he shook his head, his gaze filled with regret. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice dropping. "He's gone." Marcus didn't respond. He had known it from the moment Ethan took his last breath in his arms, from when those eyes closed forever. But hearing that confirmation felt like a knife stabbing into his heart, deeper, more painful. He took a deep breath, his hands clenched into fists, the dry blood on his hands cracking into tiny pieces. "I know," he whispered, his voice choked, but there were no tears left. Those had run dry, replaced by a cold determination. The second medical staff member stepped closer to Walsh and Carver, quickly assessing their condition. "We need more vehicles," he said into the radio, his voice tense. "There are 4 injured, 1 dead." But Marcus didn't care about them. He stood up, tall and menacing, turning to look at Walsh, who was struggling to sit up, his face twisted in pain and fear. "This isn't the end," Marcus said, his voice low and cold, each word like a sentence of doom. "You took my son, but I will make you pay one by one." He pointed at Walsh, then Carver, his gaze unwavering, as if etching that vow into their minds. Walsh gasped, trying to say something, but Marcus didn't give him a chance. He turned away, walked over to Ethan, and knelt down one last time. The sound of a police siren began to echo from afar, blending with the approach of a second ambulance. Willow Creek was no longer the peaceful neighborhood it once was. It had become the center of a storm that Marcus knew wouldn't let up. He placed his hand on Ethan's chest and whispered, "I won't let them forget you, Ethan. I promise." Then he stood up, his silhouette cast on the grass under the flashing lights, like a warrior ready to step into a new battle. Walsh and Carver watched, their eyes now filled with fear. They knew that Marcus Hayes was not someone who would let things slide. And tonight, they had made an enemy they couldn't defeat. Willow Creek is no longer the peaceful neighborhood with its wooden houses and shady oak trees. The night is now torn apart by the flashing red and blue lights of patrol cars, the blinding white light of an ambulance, and the wailing sirens echoing down the street. Marcus Hayes stands beside Ethan's lifeless body, his hands still stained with his son's blood, his eyes burning with silent vow as he watches 2 paramedics kneeling beside him, shaking their heads in sorrow. 10 feet away, Daniel Walsh and Tom Carver lie on the grass, one clutching his stomach, the other covering his face, blood from Carver's nose mixing with the dirt, a testament to the fury Marcus just unleashed upon them. The other 2 officers, one cradling a broken arm and the other holding his chest, huddled near a black SUV, too afraid to look up at the father who just defeated them with nothing but his bare hands. But the story doesn't end on that blood-soaked field. From a house about 50 feet away, a tiny doorbell camera mounted on the porch of Mrs. Ellen Parker, who had called 911 out of suspicion of Marcus, recorded everything. From the moment Walsh and Carver stepped out of their car, guns in hand, to when they shouted for Marcus and Ethan to raise their hands, then the deafening gunfire as Carver shot Ethan, and finally, the scene of Marcus charging in to take them down, all of it was captured in sharp, undeniable video clips. Ellen, standing behind the curtain, her hands trembling as she watched the scene unfold outside, had no idea that her call had sparked a storm, and that camera was now the fuse. The sound of police sirens began to echo from a distance, blending with the wail of a second approaching ambulance. Marcus turned to look at Ethan one last time, his hand resting gently on the boy's chest, whispering, "Dad won't let them forget you." Then he stood up, his tall figure casting a shadow on the grass under the flashing lights, like a warrior ready to step into a new battle. But he didn't know that while he stood there, the video from the doorbell camera had automatically uploaded to cloud, and another neighbor, a 19-year-old named Joey, who lived about 100 feet from Ellen's house, had downloaded it from a neighborhood sharing app. Joey sat in his bedroom, the light from his laptop screen illuminating his face, his eyes wide as he watched the video. Gunshots rang out through the speakers. Marcus's screams echoed, and the sight of Ethan collapsing sent shivers down his spine. "Oh my God," he murmured, his hands trembling as he rewound a clip of Marcus taking down 4 officers like a whirlwind. He didn't know Marcus or Ethan, but he understood that this neighborhood had never seen anything like it. Without thinking much, Joey opened Twitter, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "Police just shot an unarmed man in Willow Creek, Macon, Georgia. His dad took them down right on the spot. Check this out." He attached the video, hit post, and his heart raced as he watched the view count climb by the second. In just 10 minutes, the video spread like wildfire across dry grass. From Twitter, it jumped to Facebook, then Instagram, and then TikTok with hundreds, then thousands of people in Macon and beyond witnessing Ethan's fall, hearing Marcus scream, and watching his fury directed at Walsh and Carver. 5 miles away, in a small apartment in downtown Macon, a 25-year-old community activist named Sarah sat up on her sofa as her phone buzzed incessantly. She opened the video, and as she watched Ethan take his last breath in Marcus's hands, tears streamed down her face. "I can't believe this," she whispered, gripping her phone tightly. She immediately messaged her group chat. "Everyone, gather at the Macon police station. Right now. We can't let this go unnoticed." Within 30 minutes, the news spread throughout the city. Cars began to leave the garages, headlights blazing on the streets of Macon. Dozens of people, then hundreds, gathered outside the Macon police station, about 8 miles from Willow Creek. They carried phones, portable speakers, and hastily made signs of markers. "Justice for Ethan Hayes. Police are murderers." The chants erupted, initially scattered, but soon merged into a powerful rhythm that shook the night air. "Ethan! Ethan! Ethan!" they shouted, their voices filled with rage and pain, as if that name was a call to action that couldn't be ignored. In Willow Creek, Marcus didn't hear that scream. He stood beside Ethan, watching the paramedics cover his body with a white sheet, his heart heavy as lead. The sound of police sirens was now very close, the flashing lights from the arriving cars illuminating his face, but he didn't care. Walsh, trying to sit up, looked at him with a mix of fear and anger in his eyes. "You won't get away with this," Walsh growled, but his words were weak, lacking any real conviction. Marcus turned back to Walsh, his gaze as cold as ice. "I'm not the one who needs to run," he said, his voice deep and steady. "It's you all who should." He didn't know that out there, the city was ablaze because of him, because of Ethan, and that fire wouldn't be stopping anytime soon. If you also feel your heart racing for Ethan, a guy who lost everything in an instant, hit like and subscribe to the Legendary Narratives channel right now. Let's keep the flame of justice burning bright, just like the folks in Macon did. Don't let this story end here. Thank you. The night was dark in Macon, Georgia, now shaken by the loud chants of hundreds of people gathered outside the police station, about 8 miles from Willow Creek. The soft yellow streetlights illuminated faces filled with rage, as hastily made signs were held high. "Justice for Ethan Hayes. Stop police violence." The sound of a bullhorn echoed, mixed with chant of Ethan's name, reverberating to the downtown streets, drowning out even the sparse traffic of the night. In less than an hour since a video from Mrs. Ellen Parker's doorbell camera went viral, the flames of anger had ignited, drawing people from every corner of Macon to this spot, turning an ordinary evening into an unyielding confrontation. Sarah, a 25-year-old girl leading the crowd, stood on a metal trash can about 20 feet from the police station, holding a megaphone, her brown hair hastily tied back, blowing in the night wind. "They killed Ethan Hayes," she shouted into the megaphone, her voice trembling with anger and pain. "An unarmed guy, just graduated from medical school, shot dead right in front of his dad. We can't let this keep happening." The crowd responded with collective roar, hundreds of fists raised high, phones lifted to capture the moment. The video Joey posted on Twitter had now spread beyond Macon, reaching Atlanta, Savannah, and even further, racking up tens of thousands of views in just 45 minutes. Inside the police station, the atmosphere was as tense as a drawn bowstring. Daniel Walsh and Tom Carver had been taken to a temporary medical room about 50 feet from the main entrance, hastily bandaged by a paramedic. Walsh sat on a chair, clutching his stomach, his face twisted in pain from Marcus Hayes' punch, but his eyes now reflected nothing but worry. Carver sat across from him, his nose wrapped in gauze, dry blood still clinging to his chin, his eyes vacant, as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. "They know everything," Walsh hissed, glancing to the small window where the shouts of the crowd echoed in. "That video, it's everywhere." Carver shook his head, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to. I swear I thought that kid had a gun." But Walsh didn't respond. He stood up, dragging himself to the window, looking out at the crowd that was growing larger, now over 300 people, with more cars continuing to pour in, signs reading "murderer," and Catch Walsh and Carver. Hit him like a punch, making his heart race. We're done for, Walsh whispered, his hands gripping the armrests tightly. Outside, Sarah lowered the speaker, jumped off the trash can, and turned to the crowd. They think they can hide in there, she shouted, pointing at the police station. But we won't let them get away with it. Ethan wasn't the first, but he will be the last. We're going to make them pay. The crowd roared again, the chant of Ethan, Ethan, echoing like a curse, causing the windows of the police station to tremble slightly. A few feet away, a group of young people began pushing against a metal fence in front of the station, the clanging of metal ringing out sharply. A man in his 40s, wearing a denim jacket, held his phone high and shouted, "They can't deny it anymore. We have the proof." Others picked up small stones from the sidewalk and hurled them at the police station's glass doors, the first shattering sound echoing as a stone hit its target. The crowd was no longer just a group of protesters. It was turning into an uncontrollable wave. Inside, a young officer rushed into the medical room, his face pale. "Boss, they're breaking through the barricade," he shouted, his hands trembling around the radio. "The crowd is over 400 people and still growing. What do we do?" Walsh turned around, his gaze shifting between fear and anger. "Calling the riot team," he snapped. "Tell them bring shields and tear gas. We can't let them in here." Carver looked up, his voice weak. "A little spicy? Are you crazy? That will only make things worse." But Walsh didn't listen. He stepped into the hallway, shouting into the radio, "Riot team, get to the Macon station now. We're surrounded." The response crackled through the radio, fragmented, but Walsh knew time was running out. The crowd out there didn't just want justice, they wanted blood. In Willow Creek, Marcus stood beside Ethan, unaware of the storm brewing 8 miles away. The newly arrived police cars surrounded the yard, 6 officers stepping out, guns raised, their eyes tense as they looked at him. "Hands on your head," one shouted, his voice trembling. "You're under arrest for assaulting an officer." But Marcus didn't move. He stared at them, his gaze icy, Ethan's blood still smeared on his hands as a haunting reminder. "Go ahead and try to catch me," Marcus said, his voice low and menacing. "But you won't be able to hide this. Not ever." He didn't realize that out there, hundreds of people were shouting Ethan's name, and the wave of anger he had unintentionally stirred was starting to sweep everything away. The sound of shattering glass echoed once more in front of the police station. As the crowd pushed harder, the metal barricades swaying dangerously. Sarah raised the megaphone one last time, shouting, "We won't stop until they pay." And the roar of the crowd responded, like an unyielding declaration of war. The night in Macon, Georgia, has turned into a sea of angry faces, with over 500 people gathered outside the police station, just 8 miles from Willow Creek. The sound of shattering glass, the clash of metal from the toppled barricades, and the chant of justice for Ethan Hayes thunder through the air, drowning out every other sound in the city. The dim yellow streetlights and glow of raised cell phones illuminate faces filled with rage, fists raised high without pause. Sarah, standing in the midst of the crowd, holding a megaphone, her brown hair blowing in the night wind, shouts the final battle cry, "We won't stop until they pay." The crowd responds with a collective roar, powerful enough to shake the very concrete walls of the police station. Inside, Daniel Walsh stood in the hallway, clutching his stomach in agony from Marcus Hayes' punch, his face pale as he gazed out the window. The sound of shattering glass echoed again, a rock flying through the window of the adjacent room, landing on the floor with a sharp thud. Tom Carver huddled in the medical room 50 feet away, his nose still bandaged, his eyes wide with panic as he looked at Walsh, pleading for help. "They're going to break in here." Carver shouted, his voice trembling, "We have to do something." But Walsh didn't respond right away. He turned back, yelling into the radio, "Where's the riot team? We need them right now." The voice crackled over the radio. "On the way. 2 miles out, 5 minutes." But 5 minutes felt like an eternity. The crowd outside wasn't waiting. They surged forward, the 6-foot metal barrier creaking and then crashing to ground with a thunderous bang. A group of young people charged ahead, slamming their hands against the main glass door of the police station, the sound of shattering glass spreading like a spiderweb. "Murderers! Bring out Walsh and Carver," they shouted, their voices filled with rage, while others hurled rocks, water bottles, anything they could get their hands on. Sarah raised the megaphone once more, shouting, "They think they can hide behind these walls. But we are more, we are stronger. Ethan Hayes didn't die in vain." The crowd roared the chant of Ethan. Ethan had transformed into a collective heartbeat, an irresistible call to action. A man in his 30s, wearing a black hoodie, climbed onto a nearby parked car, holding his phone high to show Joey's video. "Look," he yelled, "they shot him when he was doing nothing. We won't let them get away with this." In Willow Creek, Marcus stood beside Ethan, his cold gaze fixed on the 6 newly arrived police officers, guns raised and surrounding him. "Hands on your head," one officer shouted again, his voice tense, but Marcus didn't move. He stared at them. Ethan's blood dried on his hands, his voice low and menacing. "You won't be able to cover this up." He had no idea that 8 miles away, hundreds were fighting for him. For Ethan and the storm he had unwittingly unleashed had spiraled out of control. The roar of engines echoed from afar as the riot squad finally arrived. 6 armored vehicles came to a stop about 100 feet from the police station. Their doors swung open, and dozens of officers clad in black, riot shields in hand, stepped out in tight formation. They raised their shields high, advancing toward the crowd, the sound of their boots hitting the asphalt resonating like a war drum. "Disperse immediately!" An officer shouted to the loudspeaker, his voice harsh and gravelly. "This is your final warning." But the crowd wouldn't back down. A water bottle flew through the air, smashing against the shield of the leading officer, shattering into a million pieces. A scream erupted, and the crowd surged forward, pushing hard against the line of shields, the clash of metal and the roar of voices blending into a chaotic symphony. Sarah stood in the midst of the throng, pressed tightly against someone else, but she didn't stop shouting, "Don't back down. We're stronger than they are." An officer fired tear gas, the sound echoing as the white smoke spread, causing dozens of people to cough violently, their eyes stinging. But instead of fleeing, they picked up the canister, hurling it back toward the riot squad, a small explosion sounding as it hit the ground. Inside the station, Walsh burst out the front door, peering through the shattered glass, his face ashen. "They've lost it," he shouted, turning to the young officer standing beside him. "Call for backup. We can't hold them off any longer." But the officer just shook his head, his voice trembling. "There's no one left, sir. Everyone's already here." Walsh turned back, watching as the crowd had now broken to the shield line, pushing the riot team back step by step. One officer fell, his shield wrenched away, and the mob surged forward, slamming hard against the front door. The glass shattered, shards raining down on the floor like confetti, and dozens of people surged into the police station hallway, shouting, "Walsh! Carver! Bring them out!" Walsh stepped back, his hands trembling as he pulled out his gun, but he knew he couldn't shoot not now, with hundreds of eyes and phones capturing every moment. Carver burst out of the medical room, yelling, "We have to hide!" But there was nowhere left to run. The crowd was right in front of them, just 10 feet away, their eyes filled with rage. In Willow Creek, Marcus heard the distant wail of police sirens fading away, but he had no idea that the city was erupting because of him. 6 officers surrounded him, rushing in, one brandishing a baton, shouting, "Get down!" But Marcus didn't back down. He grabbed the officer's arm, twisting it hard, causing the baton to clatter to the ground. Then he punched straight into the officer's chest, sending him stumbling back. "You can't catch me," he roared, his voice echoing. But before he could strike again, another officer fired a taser, electricity coursing through his body, causing him to collapse, his body convulsing. They rushed in, handcuffing him, dragging him to a patrol car, but Marcus didn't resist anymore. He took one last look at Ethan, his body now covered with a white blanket, and whispered to himself, "I won't stop, son." In Macon, the crowd had taken over the police station, the shouts of Ethan Hayes ringing out like a declaration. Power had shifted and the wave of anger couldn't be stopped. Macon, Georgia, was no longer a peaceful place after that fateful night at Willow Creek. Just hours after Marcus Hayes was handcuffed and dragged away from the blood-soaked grass where Ethan lay dead, the city erupted in an unprecedented fury. A crowd of over 500 people broke through the police station doors, pushing back the riot squad, turning the chant of Ethan Hayes into a battle cry that echoed through the streets. The video from Mrs. Ellen Parker's doorbell camera captured the moment Daniel Walsh and Tom Carver shot Ethan, only to be taken down by Marcus, and it spread across the nation, racking up millions of views on social media. But in the darkness of a cold cell at the Bibb County Jail, just 5 miles from the Macon police station, Marcus couldn't hear their cries. All he could hear was the pounding of his own heart, the sound of Ethan's blood still echoing in his mind. Marcus sat on the metal bench in the cell, his hands still tightly cupped behind his back, the dry blood of Ethan flaking off his shirt like an indelible reminder. His left shoulder throbbed from the graze of a bullet at Willow Creek. His body felt drained from the shock of the taser, but his gaze remained unwavering. He looked through the bars at the grim gray concrete wall 10 feet away, and in his heart, the vow to Ethan burned fiercely. Dad won't let them forget you. He didn't know that out there, hundreds were fighting for him, but he knew one thing: his battle wasn't over, even if it was now confined within these 4 walls. The iron door creaked open with a dry squeak, and a woman stepped inside, her high heels clicking rhythmically on the stone floor. She was about 35 years old, with her black hair pulled back neatly, dressed in a sharp gray suit, her eyes sharp as a razor. This was Rachel Coleman, a renowned civil rights attorney in Georgia, who had built her reputation by tackling cases that no one else dared to touch. She stood before the cell, holding a thick stack of documents about 2 inches deep, looking at Marcus through the bars with a gaze that was both curious and resolute. "I'm Rachel Coleman," she said, her voice deep and clear, carrying a hint of the distinctive southern drawl from Georgia. "I'm here to help you, Mr. Hayes, if you want." She set the stack of documents down on the floor, sat on a metal chair about 3 feet away from bars, and crossed her arms over her chest. "I've seen the video. The whole country has. You're caught in the eye of a storm, and I can get you out of here, but not without a price." Marcus looked up, his gaze cold but not hostile. He tilted his head, assessing her as he would an enemy on the battlefield. "What's the price?" he asked, his voice hoarse after hours of silence, yet still carrying the weight of someone who wouldn't be easily swayed. Rachel smiled faintly, not the kind of smile that radiates joy, but the kind that comes from someone who knows they're stepping into a battle. "The price is that you have to trust me," she replied. "They're going to throw everything at you, attacking the police, resisting arrest, maybe even public disorder. They want to bury you under a mountain of charges, so everyone forgets about Ethan. But I won't let that happen. I'll take Walsh and Carver to court, but you have to let me lead the way." Marcus didn't answer right away. He looked down at his tightly bound hands, the dry blood of Ethan still clinging to his skin, and the memories of that night flooded back the sound of gunfire, Ethan whispering "Dad" before he took his last breath. He took a deep breath, looked up at Rachel. "I don't care what they do to me," he said, his voice low and steady. "I just want those 2 to pay. If you can make that happen, I'll follow you." Rachel nodded, her eyes shining with a spark of determination. "Good," she said, standing up and picking up the stack of documents. "Then, let's get started. The crowd out there is demanding justice, but they can't come in here. I can, and I will make the system bow down to you." She knocked on the iron door. An officer opened it, and she walked through, leaving Marcus with a flicker of hope amidst the darkness. Just a few hours later, Rachel stood in front of the Bibb County Courthouse, 2 miles from the jail, facing a crowd of reporters and hundreds of protesters gathered 50 feet away. Holding up signs that read "Justice for Ethan," she raised her hand, calling for silence, then spoke loudly, her voice echoing to the microphone. "Marcus Hayes is not a criminal. He's a victim. His son, Ethan Hayes, was shot and killed by the Macon police while unarmed, and now they want to lock him up to cover up their crime. I won't let that happen." The crowd roared. The chant "Free Marcus" echoed, but inside the jail, Marcus couldn't hear it. He sat there, his gaze hardening, and inside him, the legal battle had just begun. He didn't know who Rachel was before tonight, but he felt she was someone who could turn his vow into reality. At the Macon police station, Walsh and Carver listened to news over the radio, their faces going pale. Rachel Coleman, Walsh whispered, his hands trembling. We're done for. They knew her reputation as a lawyer who never lost when it was evidence, and that video was the ace in the hole they couldn't overcome. The atmosphere in Bibb County Jail was heavy as lead, the dim light from the overhead bulb casting a dull glow on the gray concrete walls. Where Marcus Hayes sat on a metal bench, his hands still tightly shackled behind his back. It had been over 12 hours since he was dragged away from the blood-soaked field at Willow Creek, where Ethan took his last breath in his arms. The dried blood of his son still clung to his shirt on his hands, like an indelible scar, and every time he closed his eyes, he could still hear the gunshots from Tom Carver's Glock that had taken everything he loved. But now, in the cold cell just 5 miles from the Macon police station, a glimmer of hope had emerged. Rachel Coleman, a civil rights attorney with sharp eyes and a promise to bring Daniel Walsh and Carver to justice. The iron door creaked open again, and Rachel stepped inside, holding a thicker stack of documents than before, her high heels clicking steadily on the stone floor. She didn't sit down this time. Instead, she stood in front of the bars, about 3 feet away from Marcus, her eyes shining with a mix of determination and urgency. I just got back from the courthouse, she said, her voice low but sharp, slicing through the heavy silence. The crowd out there isn't backing down over 700 people now, and they're blocking the entrance to downtown Macon. The video has gone national. CNN, MSNBC, even Fox are all talking about Ethan. Marcus looked up, his gaze unwavering, but inside him, a smoldering fire ignited at the sound of his son's name. What did they say? He asked, his voice hoarse, carrying the weight of a man who had just lost everything yet was still ready to fight. Rachel set the stack of documents down on the floor, crossing her arms over her chest. They call it a cold-blooded murder, she replied. The video is undeniable. Ethan was unarmed. His hands were up, and Carver fired 3 shots without hesitation. Walsh just stood there, doing nothing to stop it. The whole country is boiling over Marcus, but the police aren't sitting idly by either. They're trying to spin a story saying you were a threat, that Ethan resisted, that this was self-defense. Marcus scoffed, a bitter laugh that held no joy. Self-defense, he repeated, his voice dropping, cold as ice. My son was kneeling on the ground, hand behind his head, and they shot him like he was a dog. And me? I was just trying to protect him after they had already killed him. They want to call that self-defense. He clenched his fists, the cuffs biting into his skin, but he felt no pain. The hurt in his heart was greater than anything else. Rachel nodded, her eyes locked on him. I know, she said, her voice softening a bit, but still firm. They'll try to twist the truth, just like they always do. But this time, they won't get the chance. The video is undeniable proof, and I'm going to use it to take them down. I've demanded they release you immediately. There's no reason to keep you locked up when you're the victim. But there's one problem. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his eyes narrowing. What's the problem? Rachel took a deep breath, stepping closer to the bars, just a foot away from him. They want to take you to court for attacking Walsh and Carver, she said, her voice dropping, tinged with tension. They claim you assaulted 4 officers, broke Carver's nose, left Walsh with internal bruising, and seriously injured the other 2. They're trying to paint you as a violent criminal to distract from Ethan's death. If we don't play by the rules, they'll bury you under all those charges. Marcus looked at her, his gaze unwavering. They killed my son right in front of me, he said, his voice slow but heavy with emotion. I don't regret hitting them. I only regret not doing more. He leaned forward, the handcuffs clinking as they hit the bench. You say I should trust you. So what are you doing to make sure those 2 don't get away? Rachel smiled faintly, this time with a confident grin. I'm going to take them to court, she replied. Not self-defense. Not paid leave. I'm going to escalate the second-degree murder charges against Walsh and Carver. The video shows Ethan wasn't a threat, and he acted out of pain, not violence. I've reached out to the prosecutor's office. They're under pressure from the crowd and the media. They can't ignore this any longer. Marcus nodded slowly, his gaze softening a bit, but the fire within him still burned bright. Are you sure they will listen? He asked, his voice dropping. I've seen how this system works. It doesn't work for people like me. Rachel leaned down, looking straight into his eyes through the bars. "This time there is," she said, her voice steady, "because I'm going to make sure they have no other choice. The crowd out there, the video, and I were three forces they can't ignore. But you need to be patient, Marcus. This isn't the battlefield you're used to. This is the battlefield of the law, and I'm your soldier." The iron door swung open again, and an officer stepped in, his voice dry and harsh. "Time's up, Miss Coleman." Rachel stood up, grabbed her stack of documents, but before leaving, she turned back to look at Marcus. "Tomorrow I'll get you out of here," she said, "and then we'll make them kneel." She walked out, leaving Marcus with a fresh feeling not of hope, but of cold determination. At the Macon police station, Walsh and Carver sat in the conference room, listening to the screams of the crowd echoing through the shattered window. An officer burst in, his face ashen. "Rachel Coleman just filed a lawsuit," he said, his voice trembling. "She wants to charge us with murder." Walsh slammed his hand on the table. Carver buried his head in his hands, but they both knew the legal battle had begun, and there was no turning back. The cell in the Bibb County Jail was no longer a place of confinement for Marcus Hayes the next morning. Just as promised, Rachel Coleman had returned, and after an emergency hearing at the Bibb County Courthouse just 2 miles away, the judge was compelled to release him not out of mercy, but due to the pressure from the crowd of over 1,000 people blocking the road outside the courthouse, along with the relentless media coverage of the video showing Ethan being shot in Willow Creek. Marcus stepped out of jail, his hands free of cuffs, but the dry blood of Ethan still clung to his shirt like an unshakable reminder. Rachel stood waiting for him at the gate, her gray suit still crisp, her eyes shining with the confidence of someone who had just won the first battle. "Welcome back," Rachel said, her voice deep yet carrying a rare warmth. "Now we can really get started." She led him to a black sedan parked about 20 feet away, where dozens of reporters and protesters were holding up signs that read, "Justice for Ethan." Marcus didn't say a word, just nodded, his gaze cold yet burning with the intensity of the legal battle that was now his new battlefield. And he believed Rachel would be the soldier guiding him to victory. Just a week later, the courtroom at the Bibb County Courthouse was packed. Over 100 seats were filled with reporters, protesters, and families of victims from similar cases, all eyes fixed at the front, where Marcus sat beside Rachel at the plaintiff's table, about 15 feet from the judge's bench. Across from them, Daniel Walsh and Tom Carver sat next to their defense attorney, a middle-aged man named Richard Holt, dressed in a dark blue suit, his sharp gaze betraying a hint of tension. Walsh and Carver looked haggard. Carver with a bandage on his nose, Walsh with a pale face, both too afraid to meet Marcus's eyes. Judge, a woman in her 50s named Margaret Evans, rapped her gavel, the sound echoing as she called for silence. "We will begin the trial of Daniel Walsh and Tom Carver on charges of second-degree murder in the case involving Ethan Hayes," she stated, her tone steady yet serious. "Prosecution, you may proceed." Rachel stood up, stepping into the center of the courtroom, holding a small screen that displayed a video from the doorbell camera. "Your Honor," she said, her voice resonating, powerful like a hammer strike. "Ethan Hayes, 27 years old, just graduated from Emory University's medical school, was shot dead by these two defendants right in front of his father, Marcus Hayes, in Willow Creek, Macon, on the night of March 11, 2025. He was unarmed, hands raised, complying with every command. This isn't self-defense. This is cold-blooded murder." She pressed a button, and the video played on a large screen behind the judge, the screams of Marcus, the gunshots, the sight of Ethan collapsing silencing the courtroom, leaving only the sound of a few people in the crowd sobbing. Richard Holt stood up, his voice smooth yet tinged with worry. "Your Honor, my client acted in a high-pressure situation," he said. "They received a report about a suspicious suspect, and when Ethan Hayes moved his hands, they perceived it as a threat. This is a case of legitimate self-defense." But his words faltered in the face of the video, showing Ethan kneeling, hands behind his head. Clearly not a danger. Rachel turned around, her gaze sharp as a knife. "Self-defense?" she repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. "Let me call my first witness, Marcus Hayes." Marcus stood up and walked to the witness stand, each step heavy yet steady, like a soldier marching into the final battle. He swore in front of the judge, then took a seat, his eyes locked onto Walsh and Carver, making them bow their heads in avoidance. "Tell us what happened, Mr. Hayes," Rachel said, her voice softening but still firm. Marcus took a deep breath, his tone deep and clear, echoing through the courtroom. "That was the proudest night of my life," he began, his gaze distant. "Ethan had just graduated from medical school. We rented a place in Willow Creek to relax and celebrate. I went to the car to grab a gift for him, a watch from his mom and me. Then they showed up." He pointed at Walsh and Carver, his voice tightening. "They yelled at us to put our hands up, even though we hadn't done anything wrong." Ethan knelt down, hand behind his head, trying to explain that we were there legally. But Carver shot him 3 times, right in front of me. I held him as he died, and they just stood there watching. The courtroom fell silent. The sound of sobbing echoed again. Rachel stepped closer and asked, "Did they have any reason to shoot?" Marcus shook his head, his eyes bloodshot. "No, he wasn't armed. He didn't resist. They killed him because they wanted to, because they looked at him and saw something they feared, not a human being." Holt stood up, his voice tense. "Mr. Hayes, you attacked my client afterward, didn't you? That shows you're a violent man." But Marcus looked him straight in the eye, his voice steady. "I hit them because they killed my son right in front of me. If you had a child, what would you do if they were killed in front of you?" He remained silent, unable to respond. Rachel turned to the judge. No more questions. Marcus stepped down, his gaze meeting Rachel's, and he knew she was turning his vow into reality. Walsh was called to the stand, his voice trembling. I think he had a weapon," he said, but his gaze wavered, unable to meet the crowd's eyes. Rachel interrupted. "You think, or did you just not bother to check? The video shows Ethan kneeling, hand behind his head. Did you see a weapon?" Walsh stammered. "No, but—" "No way!" Rachel shouted, her voice booming like thunder. "You let Carver shoot an innocent person, and you did nothing to stop it." Walsh hung his head, remaining silent, and the courtroom erupted with shouts from the crowd. "Murderer!" Carver stepped up to the podium, his face pale. "I panicked," he whispered. "I didn't mean to—" But Rachel wouldn't let it go. "You fired 3 shots at an unarmed man," she said, her voice icy. "That's not panic, that's murder." Carver cradled his head, unable to say anything more. The judge banged the gavel, calling for order, but the courtroom still buzzed with outrage. Marcus took a seat, his gaze fixed on Walsh and Carver, knowing they couldn't escape. Rachel turned back to the table, whispering to him, "We're winning. They have nowhere to run." Outside, the crowd was still chanting, "Ethan Hayes!" Marcus clenched his fists, his heart heavy but resolute. The legal battle had reached its peak, and he wouldn't stop until justice was served. Macon, Georgia, had turned into a battleground without gunfire in the days following Ethan Hayes' death. The fateful night at Willow Creek, where Marcus Hayes witnessed his son being shot dead by Daniel Walsh and Tom Carver, then took them down in a fit of rage, sparked a wave of outrage that spread throughout the city and beyond. Over 1,000 people broke into Macon Police Station, located 8 miles from Willow Creek, forcing the riot squad to retreat, and the video from Mrs. Ellen Parker's doorbell camera went viral with millions of views, turning the name Ethan Hayes into a symbol of injustice. But in the cold cell of the Bibb County Jail, just 5 miles from downtown, Marcus couldn't hear the crowd's chants. All he could hear was his own heartbeat, the blood of Ethan still seeming to flow through his hands, even though it had dried on his shirt since that fateful night. Marcus sat on the metal bench, his hands tightly cupped behind his back, his body feeling limp after the shock from the taser the officers used to subdue him at Willow Creek. His left shoulder throbbed from the graze of a bullet, but he didn't care. The pain inside him was greater than any wound on his body. His gaze drifted through the bars, fixating on the grim concrete wall 10 feet away. And in his mind, the image of Ethan falling on the field replayed like a film that would never stop. He had sworn to his son, "Dad won't let them forget you." And even though he was trapped within these 4 walls, that vow burned fiercely, stronger than the despair trying to pull him down. The iron door creaked open with a dry screech, and a woman stepped inside, her high heels clicking rhythmically on the stone floor, echoing in the stillness. She was about 35, with her black hair pulled up high, dressed in a sharp gray suit, her eyes sharp as a razor under the dim light. This was Rachel Coleman, a renowned civil rights attorney from Georgia, who had dedicated her entire career to tackling the unjust cases that others shied away from. She stood in front of the cell, about 3 feet away from Marcus, holding a thick stack of documents roughly 2 inches deep, her gaze sweeping over him as if assessing a warrior before battle. "I'm Rachel Coleman," she said, her voice deep and clear, carrying a hint of Southern charm. "I'm here for you, Mr. Hayes. The whole country is talking about Ethan, and I want to help you bring those 2 Walsh and Carver to justice. But you have to trust me." She set the file down on the floor, pulled a metal chair closer, and sat across from him through bars, her arms crossed over her chest. Marcus looked up, his gaze cold but not hostile. He tilted his head, assessing her as he would an enemy on the battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan. "Trust you?" he asked, his voice hoarse after hours of silence, yet still carrying the weight of someone who is not easily swayed. "I've seen how this system works. It doesn't work for people like me. What do you have to make me believe?" Rachel smiled faintly, not the kind of smile that radiates joy, but the kind that comes from someone who knows they're walking into fire. "I have a video," she replied, her voice steady. "The whole world has seen it, Ethan on his knees, hands behind his head, unarmed, and Carver shooting him 3 times. Walsh just stood there, doing nothing to stop it. That's undeniable evidence, and I'm going to use it to take them down. But I need you out there, not in here." Marcus looked at her, his gaze steady, but inside him, a small spark flickered not hope, but possibility. "They locked me up because I fought back," he said, his voice dropping. "They killed my son right in front of me, and I fought them. I don't regret it. What are you going to do about that?" Rachel leaned forward, her gaze locked onto him. "I'm going to get them to release you," she said, her voice low but filled with determination. "They have no right to hold you. You acted out of pain, not violence. The crowd out there, over 1,000 strong, is blocking the road into Macon, demanding your release. The national media is playing the video nonstop. I've filed an emergency petition to get you out today, and I'm going to win. After that, we'll take Walsh and Carver to court, not for self-defense, but for murder." Marcus took a deep breath, his hands clenched tightly behind his back, the cuffs digging into his skin. "Are you sure they'll listen?" he asked, his voice tinged with doubt. "I fought for this country, bled for it, and they still killed my son like it was nothing. The system doesn't care." Rachel stood up and walked closer to the bars, just a foot away from him. "This time they'll have to pay attention," she said, her voice ringing out like a vow, "because I won't give them any other choice. The video, the crowd, and me, they can't fight against all 3. But you have to be patient, Marcus. This is the battleground of the law, and I know how to win." The iron door opened once more, and an officer stepped in, his voice dry and harsh. "Time's up, Miss Coleman." Rachel picked up the stack of documents and turned to look at Marcus one last time. "Today, I'm getting you out," she said. "And after that, we'll make them pay." She walked out, leaving Marcus with a feeling not of relief, but a fire stoked anew. Just a few hours later, at the Bibb County Courthouse, Rachel stood before a crowd of reporters and protesters, her voice ringing out to the microphone. "Marcus Hayes is not a criminal. He's a father who lost his child. Ethan Hayes was killed right in front of him, and now we will fight for justice." The crowd roared, "Free Marcus!" And Marcus, in his cell, felt, even without hearing, that his fight had entered a new phase. Just a few hours after Rachel Coleman left the jail cell in Bibb County, Marcus Hayes stepped out to the heavy iron gate, no longer in handcuffs, but the dry blood of Ethan still clung to his shirt like an indelible reminder. The morning sun shone on his face, highlighting the rugged features of a former Delta Force commander now carrying an indescribable pain. Rachel stood waiting for him about 20 feet from the gate, next to a black sedan, holding a thick folder, her sharp eyes glowing with confidence. Behind her, a crowd of over 1,000 people gathered 50 feet away in front of the Bibb County Courthouse, holding up signs that read "Justice for Ethan" and "Free Marcus," their chants reverberating to the air of Macon, Georgia, like an unyielding declaration of war. "Welcome back," Rachel said, her voice deep yet warm, a faint smile flickering on her lips. "We just won the first round. They didn't dare keep you any longer with the whole country watching. But the real battle starts now." She opened the car door, signaling for Marcus to get in, and he complied without a word, his gaze cold yet burning with an unshakable determination. As the car rolled away, the cheers of the crowd echoed behind them, a promise that they wouldn't stop until Walsh and Carver paid the price. Just 3 days later, the courtroom at the Bibb County Courthouse was packed. Over 100 seats were filled with reporters, protesters, and families who had lost loved ones to police violence, all eyes fixed at the front, where Marcus sat next to Rachel at the plaintiff's table, about 15 feet from the judge's bench. Across from them, Daniel Walsh and Tom Carver sat beside defense attorney Richard Holt, a middle-aged man in a dark blue suit, his face tense but trying to maintain a calm demeanor. Walsh looked haggard, with dark circles under his eyes, while Carver had his head bowed, a bandage on his nose still stark white, a reminder of the fury Marcus had unleashed on them at Willow Creek. Judge Margaret Evans, a woman in her 50s with stern gaze, struck her gavel, the sound echoing as she called for silence. "We will begin the preliminary hearing for Daniel Walsh and Tom Carver on the charge of second-degree murder in the case involving Ethan Hayes," she said, her voice steady yet carrying the weight of the law. "The prosecution may present their case." Rachel stood up, stepping into the center of the courtroom, holding a small screen that displayed the video footage from the doorbell camera, a piece of evidence that had ignited the entire nation. "Your Honor," she said, her voice resonating, powerful like a knife slicing through the air. "On the night of March 11th, 2025, Ethan Hayes, a 27-year-old recent medical school graduate from Emory University, was shot dead by these two defendants in Willow Creek, Macon. He was unarmed, hands raised, complying with every command from the police. This is not self-defense. This is cold-blooded murder, and we have undeniable evidence." She pressed a button, and the video played, the sound of Marcus screaming, 3 gunshots ringing out, and the sight of Ethan collapsing in a pool of blood silenced the courtroom, leaving only the sound of sobs from a few people in the crowd. Richard Holt stood up, his voice smooth but tinged with anxiety. "Your Honor," he began, "my client acted in a high-pressure situation. They received reports about a suspicious suspect, and when Ethan Hayes moved his hand, they perceived it as a threat. This is legal self-defense under the law." He pointed towards Marcus, his voice rising, and this man, Marcus Hayes, attacked 4 officers afterward, proving he is the violent one. Rachel turned around, her gaze sharp as a knife, not giving Holt a chance to continue. "Self-defense?" she repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. "Let me call my first witness, Marcus Hayes." Marcus stood up, stepping up to the witness stand, each heavy step steady and resolute, like a soldier marching into a decisive battle. He swore in front of the judge, then took his seat, his eyes locking onto Walsh and Carver, making them look down in avoidance. "Tell us what happened, Mr. Hayes," Rachel said, her voice softening but still firm. Marcus took a deep breath, his tone deep and clear, resonating to the courtroom like an undeniable accusation. "That was the proudest night of my life," he began, his gaze distant, as if reliving that last moment of happiness. "Ethan had just graduated from medical school. We rented a place in Willow Creek to celebrate, just the 2 of us, a nice dinner, a gift I pulled from the car for him, and then they showed up." He pointed at Walsh and Carver, his voice hardening, anger bubbling up. "They yelled at us to put our hands up, even though we hadn't done anything wrong." Ethan knelt down, hands behind his head, trying to explain that we had the right to be there. But Carver shot him 3 times, right in front of me. I held him as he died, blood running to my fingers, and they just stood there, doing nothing. The courtroom fell silent, the sound of sobbing rising from the crowd. Rachel stepped closer and asked, "Did Ethan do anything to threaten them?" Marcus shook his head, his eyes bloodshot but dry. The tears had run out since that night. "No, he wasn't armed, didn't resist. He just wanted to explain, but they wouldn't give him the chance." Holt stood up, his voice tense as he tried to counter. "Mr. Hayes, you assaulted my client afterward, didn't you? That shows you're a violent person." But Marcus looked him straight in the eye, his voice unwavering. I hit them because they killed my son right in front of me. If you had a child, what would you do if they were killed like that? He remained silent, unable to respond. Rachel turned to the judge. No more questions. Marcus stepped down, his gaze meeting Rachel's, and he knew the blade of justice was tilting in their favor. But the battle wasn't over, and he was ready to see it through to the end. The courtroom at the Bibb County Courthouse in Macon, Georgia, on the last day of the trial, was no longer a quiet space of law. It had turned into a battleground where justice would be decided. Marcus Hayes sat next to Rachel Coleman at the plaintiff's table, his gaze locked onto Daniel Walsh and Tom Carver, the two men who had killed Ethan Hayes right in front of him at Willow Creek 3 months ago. A crowd of over 1,500 people gathered outside, just 50 feet from the courthouse, holding high signs that read "Justice for Ethan" and chanting his name, their voices shaking the very concrete walls. The video from Mrs. Ellen Parker's doorbell camera undeniable evidence had spread across the globe, and today, after weeks of intense arguments, the jury finally entered, bringing with them the verdict that the entire nation had been waiting for. Judge Margaret Evans rapped a gavel, the sharp bang-bang echoing through the room, demanding silence. "The jury has reached a verdict," she said, her tone serious yet tinged with an unusual tension. "Please read it." A man in his 40s, the foreman of the jury, stood up, holding a piece of paper in his hand. His gaze swept across the courtroom, from Marcus to Rachel, then to Walsh and Carver, before he spoke clearly. In the case against Daniel Walsh and Tom Carver, charged with second-degree murder in connection with the death of Ethan Hayes, he began, his voice steady yet carrying an undeniable weight. "We, the jury, find both defendants guilty." The courtroom erupted in shouts, applause, and sobs from the crowd inside, drowning out the judge's gavel. Marcus sat still, his hands gripping the armrest tightly, his gaze fixed on Walsh and Carver, who now hung their heads, their faces as pale as paper. Rachel turned to him, placing her hand on his shoulder, her voice low but filled with emotion. "We did it, Marcus," she said, her eyes shining with a mix of joy and exhaustion after weeks of relentless fighting. "They won't escape 25 years in prison, no parole. This is a historic victory." Marcus nodded slowly, but he didn't smile. He didn't feel joy, just a sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted off his chest, yet a deep sadness still weighed heavily on his heart. Ethan wasn't coming back, but at least justice had been served. Judge Evans banged her gavel again, her voice rising to drown out the noise. "Daniel Walsh and Tom Carver, you are both sentenced to 25 years in prison for second-degree murder, with no possibility of parole," she declared, her gaze fixed firmly on the two defendants. "This is the final verdict." Walsh held his head in his hands. Carver broke down in tears, but no one in the room paid them any mind. All eyes were on Marcus, the father who had turned his pain into a movement to change the entire system. As Walsh and Carver were led away, their handcuffs tight, Marcus stood up and walked out of the courtroom, with Rachel by his side. The crowd outside erupted as he appeared, the chants of "Ethan! Ethan!" booming like thunder, thousands of people raising their hands to greet him, their eyes red but filled with pride. Sarah, the girl who had led the protest outside the Macon police station, rushed through the crowd and hugged Marcus tightly. "You did it," she shouted, her voice choked with emotion. "Ethan would be so proud." Marcus embraced her back, but he didn't say anything. He just nodded, his gaze distant, as if looking back to Willow Creek, where it all began. The next day, Marcus stood alone at Oak Hill Cemetery, 3 miles from downtown Macon, in front of the stone marker engraved with Ethan Hayes' name. The June breeze swept through, carrying the humid heat of Georgia, but he didn't feel it. He knelt down, placing his hand on the stone, his fingers gliding over the inscription, "Ethan Hayes, 1998 to 2025 healer, beloved son." In front of him was a small wooden box, the one he had once used to hold the silver watch, Ethan's final gift, now containing a thin notebook filled with messages from Ethan's mother and himself, written over the years as notes to him. "I did it, Ethan," Marcus whispered, his voice hoarse, tears streaming down his face, soaking into dry earth beneath him. "You changed everything. I just wish you were here to see it." He placed the box in a small nook before the gravestone, closing the lid as if sending a piece of his heart along with Ethan. He stood up, gazing at the deep blue sky, and for the first time in 3 months, he felt a flicker of peace, not because of victory, but because Ethan didn't die in vain. In the heart of Macon, news of the verdict spread across the nation. CNN ran the headline, "Historic Victory. 2 police officers sentenced to 25 years for killing unarmed man." Activists from Atlanta to New York held press conferences, calling this a turning point in the fight against police violence. Rachel Coleman stood before the courthouse, facing dozens of microphones, her voice ringing out, "This is not just Marcus Hayes' victory. This is a victory for everyone who has ever been let down by the system." But for Marcus, victory isn't about applause or the spotlight. It's the moment he stands before Ethan's grave, knowing that Walsh and Carver will pay for what they've done, that his son's death has forced an entire system to take a hard look at itself. He turns away from the cemetery, his silhouette cast on the dirt road under the sun, tall and unyielding like the very first day in Willow Creek. The legal battle may be over, but the legacy of Ethan and his own is just beginning. Macon, Georgia, on a June morning in 2025, was no longer the peaceful city that once had beneath the shade of oak trees and wooden houses. 3 months after that fateful night in Willow Creek, where Ethan Hayes was shot dead by Daniel Walsh and Tom Carver, right in front of Marcus Hayes, this city had become the epicenter of a movement that transcended state lines. The historic verdict in Bibb County Court just a week ago, when Walsh and Carver were sentenced to 25 years in prison without parole for second-degree murder, echoed across the United States, from Atlanta to Los Angeles, from New York to Chicago. The video from Mrs. Ellen Parker's doorbell camera, undeniable evidence, not only brought the 2 officers to justice, but also turned the name Ethan Hayes into a symbol of change, a flame that could not be extinguished. Marcus Hayes stood alone at Oak Hill Cemetery, 3 miles from downtown Macon, before the stone marker engraved with his son's name. Ethan Hayes, 1998 to 2025, a healer, beloved son. The summer breeze swept through, carrying the characteristic humid heat of Georgia, rustling the dry oak leaves that had fallen onto the red earth around him. He knelt down, his hand gently resting on the stone, his fingers gliding over the deeply carved letters, feeling each stroke as if a part of Ethan still lived on. In front of him sat a small wooden box, the same box that once held the silver watch he had planned to gift Ethan that night, now containing a thin notebook filled with the words he and Ethan's mother had written over the years, like messages that had never been fully spoken. "I did it, Ethan," Marcus whispered, his voice hoarse, tears streaming down his cheeks, falling on the dry ground beneath his feet. "You changed everything. I just wish you were here to see it." He opened the box, placing the notebook into a small nook before the gravestone, closing the lid as if sending a piece of his heart along with Ethan. He stood up, gazing at the deep blue sky without a single cloud, and for the first time in 3 months since that night, he felt a sense of peace, not because he had triumphed over Walsh and Carver, but because he knew Ethan's death was not in vain. 8 miles away, the heart of Macon was shaking with an unprecedented event. Over 2,000 people gathered at the Central Park, just 2 miles from the Macon police station, to attend a memorial for Ethan organized by Sarah, the girl who had led the protest on that fateful night. Signs reading "Ethan Lives On" and "Justice for All" were held high, and small candles flickered in the wind, illuminating the faces of thousands young and old, white and black united here for a common purpose. Sarah stood on a 5-foot wooden platform, microphone in hand, her brown hair blowing in the breeze, her voice resonating with deep emotion. "Ethan Hayes is not just a name," she said, her voice choked yet powerful. "He was a doctor, a son, a person who wanted to save lives. And when the police took his life, we stood up. Marcus Hayes stood up to say enough is enough." The crowd roared, the sound of applause echoing, drowning out the wind rustling to the old oaks around the park. Last week's verdict was our victory, but it's not the end. This is the beginning of a world where no one has to die like Ethan. Rachel Coleman, the attorney who brought Walsh and Carver to justice, stood beside Sarah at the podium, her gray suit now wrinkled after weeks of relentless fighting. She stepped up, microphone in hand, her voice deep and clear, resonating through the crowd. "I told Marcus that we would make the system kneel," she said, her eyes shining with pride. "And we did. But this isn't just about Marcus or Ethan. This is about all of us. This verdict is the first time in Georgia's history that 2 officers have been sentenced to long prison terms for the murder of an unarmed person. It's a seed, and we will plant it everywhere. The crowd erupted. The chant of Ethan, Ethan, rising like a prayer, a promise. At Oak Hill Cemetery, Marcus couldn't hear their voices, but he felt a vibration in the air, as if Ethan's spirit was reaching out to him through the thousands of hearts beating in unison. He turned away from the gravestone, walking down the dirt path, his silhouette cast on the ground beneath the sun, tall and unyielding, just like the day he faced Walsh and Carver at Willow Creek. Meanwhile, in Atlanta, 85 miles away from Macon, news of the verdict spread like wildfire. Activists gathered in front of the Georgia State Capitol, holding high banners that read, "Ethan Hayes, the law change agent." A group of young lawyers, inspired by Rachel Coleman, announced plans to establish the Ethan Hayes Fund, a nonprofit organization aimed at providing legal support for the families of victims of police violence. A woman in her 30s, standing in the midst of the crowd, shouted through a megaphone, "Ethan didn't die in vain. We will fight just like Marcus did." National media is also in on it. CNN runs a headline, "From Willow Creek to the Nation, Ethan Hayes' legacy changes American law." A reporter, standing outside the Bibb County Courthouse, speaks into the camera. This ruling is not just a victory for Marcus Hayes. It's a wake-up call for police systems across the country. Ethan Hayes, a 27-year-old young man, has achieved what decades of struggle could not. In Macon, as the memorial came to an end, Sarah and Rachel stepped down from the podium, embracing each other amidst a continuous applause. Sarah turned to Rachel, her voice dropping. "Did he come?" "Marcus." Rachel shook her head, her gaze distant. "He needs time," she said. "But he knows that Ethan changed everything." That night, Marcus sat alone in the small house in Atlanta, where he and Ethan had lived before moving to Willow Creek. He turned on the TV, and Ethan's image appeared, his warm smile from graduation day shining through, alongside the crowd in Macon chanting his name. He turned off the TV, stood up, and walked to the dining table where the silver watch used to rest in its wooden box. He picked it up, his fingers gliding over the frosted glass, and for the first time he smiled a sad smile, but one filled with a touch of pride. "You did it, kid," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You make your dad proud." He set the watch down, gazing out the window at the night sky, and he knew Ethan's legacy had gone far beyond Willow Creek, beyond Macon, beyond anything he'd ever dreamed. Night fell over Atlanta, Georgia, draping the city in a quiet black veil, punctuated only by the soft glow of streetlights and the flickering lights from distant homes. Marcus Hayes sat in the small house that had once been his and Ethan's sanctuary, located 85 miles from downtown Macon, a place he had left after the historic victory at the Bibb County Courthouse. The silver watch, a gift he had planned to give Ethan on that fateful night in Willow Creek, lay silently on the dining table, its glass face dimly reflecting the faint light from the ceiling. He picked it up, his fingers gliding over the cold surface, and in that moment, memories of Ethan flooded back the warm smile on his face during medical school graduation, the laughter they shared over steak in their rented home, and the final whisper, "Dad," before he left forever. Marcus set the clock down, stood up, and walked to the window to gaze at the night sky. The June breeze swept in, carrying the warmth of summer, but inside him, a strange sense of peace began to creep in, not because the pain had faded, but because he knew Ethan had left an indelible mark. The victory over Daniel Walsh and Tom Carver, 2 officers sentenced to 25 years in prison, without parole for second-degree murder, was not just justice for Ethan. It was a spark that ignited an entire movement, a legacy far beyond anything Marcus had ever imagined. 85 miles away in Macon, the Central Park still shone brightly despite the late hour. The memorial for Ethan, organized by Sarah, had come to an end, but hundreds of people remained, holding candles and phones high, their tiny lights forming a sea of stars in the darkness. Sarah stood among them, her brown hair cascading down her shoulders, her voice resonating through the microphone. No longer the angry shout from the night they broke into the police station, but a gentle yet powerful call. "Ethan Hayes has given us a gift," she said, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. He showed us that when we stand together, nothing can stop us. Let's carry his flame everywhere, from Macon to every city across this nation. The crowd responded with a gentle applause, not loud like before, but deep and resonant, like a silent promise. Rachel Coleman stood next to Sarah, her gray suit now replaced by a simple t-shirt that read, "Ethan Lives On." She stepped up, microphone in hand, her voice deep and clear, echoing through the quiet space. "I promised Marcus that we would change the system," she said, her eyes shining with pride. "And we did. But this isn't the end, this is just the beginning. Ethan isn't just a name on a stone. He's the reason we fight, and we won't stop." In Atlanta, Marcus couldn't hear their words, but he felt the tremors through the news on TV. He turned on the screen, and there was Ethan, a picture of him in a white lab coat on graduation day, alongside scenes of thousands in Macon holding candles in remembrance. A CNN reporter stood in front of the Bibb County Courthouse, his voice ringing out. The historic verdict in Macon is not just a victory for Marcus Hayes. It's a wake-up call for the entire nation. Ethan Hayes, a 27-year-old young man, has accomplished what decades of struggle could not, holding the system accountable. Marcus turned off the TV and stepped out into the backyard of the house, where he and Ethan used to play basketball on an old hoop attached to an oak tree. He looked up at the sky, where the stars twinkled like candles in Macon, and he smiled a bittersweet smile filled with pride. "You make me proud, kid," he whispered, his voice choked, tears streaming down his face, but he didn't wipe them away. He stood there for a long time, letting the night breeze carry away the pain, leaving behind a sense of peace he never thought he would find. Meanwhile, Ethan's legacy spread far beyond Macon and Atlanta. In Washington, D.C., over 600 miles away, lawmakers began discussing a new bill, the Ethan Hayes Act, aimed at increasing police oversight and protecting the rights of unarmed individuals. A senator stood before Congress, his voice booming through the microphone. "Ethan Hayes is a reminder that we can no longer allow innocent lives to be lost without justice. This act will ensure that this never happens again." The crowd outside the Capitol held high signs reading "Ethan Lives On," and their chants echoed through the cold, stone streets. In New York, a group of medical students from Columbia University is hosting a fundraiser for the Ethan Hayes Fund, a legal organization that Rachel and a group of young lawyers established to support the families of victims of police violence. A girl, around 25 years old, wearing a white lab coat similar to the one Ethan used to wear, stands in front of the microphone, her voice trembling as she says, "Ethan wanted to save lives, and now we will save lives in his honor, in our own way." They raised over $50,000 in one night, and that amount is just the beginning. In Macon, as the crowd began to disperse, Sarah and Rachel sat on a bench in park, watching the last candles flicker out. Sarah turned to Rachel, her voice dropping. "Will he be okay?" "Marcus." Rachel offered a faint smile, her gaze distant. "He's a warrior," she said. "He'll never stop hurting, but he'll live for Ethan." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks, and they both fell silent, letting the night breeze carry away the unspoken words. A week later, Marcus returned to Oak Hill Cemetery once again. He stood before Ethan's gravestone, holding a bouquet of white daisies, the flowers Ethan used to love as a child. He placed them down, knelt by the stone, and whispered, "You changed the world, Ethan. I was just the one who helped you get started." He stood up, took one last look at the gravestone, and turned away, his silhouette cast on the red dirt path under the sunset, tall and unyielding like the very first day in Willow Creek. Ethan's legacy is not just a historic verdict. It's the seed sown in millions of hearts, a flame that never goes out, a reminder that an ordinary person can change an entire system. Marcus walks on, no longer the grieving father, but the keeper of that flame, carrying it through time and space, so that Ethan lives on in every heartbeat of those who believe in justice. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey of strength with Marcus and Ethan Hayes on the Legendary Narratives channel. From the pain in Willow Creek to the historic victory in Macon, this story is not just about justice. It's a spark that ignites a whole system of change, a legacy of a boy who lived to save others. If your heart resonates with Ethan, drop a heart and hit that subscribe button so you won't miss out on more inspiring stories like this one. We take pride in sharing these moving tales, and having you here is our greatest motivation. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you in the next video. Stay tough, stay proud, and see you soon.